The man didn't even look up when he did it. That was the part nobody could forget afterward. Not the act itself, but the indifference. Judge Carlton Hess pressed his boot down on Rowan Mercer's deed papers right there in the middle of the Dusty Creek General Store, grinding the corner into the floorboards like he was putting out a cigarette. Then he smiled at the other men standing around him and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Reckon that ranch will be mine by harvest. Man can't pay his debts with dead horses." Laughter. Easy, comfortable laughter from men who'd never once watched something they built die in their hands. Rowan Mercer stood there holding a sack of feed he could barely afford, and he said nothing. Because what do you say when the ground is already gone beneath your feet? But something was coming on that afternoon train. Something Judge Hess didn't know about. Something nobody knew about. And it was about to change everything. If this kind of story speaks to you, the kind where ordinary people find extraordinary courage, please subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The summer of 1889 in the Oklahoma Territory was the kind of summer that broke things. It broke wagon axles and well pumps and the patience of good men. It cracked the earth into patterns that looked like old skin, and it drove the creek beds down to trickles that barely covered the rocks. People said it was the hottest summer since the territory opened. People said a lot of things that summer. Most of them were true. Rowan Mercer had stopped listening to what people said sometime around the middle of June when the first horse went down. He'd found Cherokee at 3 a.m, lying on her side in the far stall with her legs moving in slow, confused circles like she was trying to run in her sleep. He'd dropped to his knees in the straw beside her and put his hand against her neck and felt the heat radiating off her skin like a cook stove. Her breathing was wrong, too fast, too shallow, and her eyes had gone glassy in a way that made something tighten hard and low in his chest. He'd sat with her until sunrise, and at sunrise, Cherokee died. He was 41 years old, and he'd been ranching this land since he was 19, and he had never once lost a horse to illness. Not one. His father had always said the Mercer stock was tough as old rope, and Rowan had believed him the way you believe things that have always been true. You don't question them. You don't prepare for them to stop being true. He buried Cherokee himself because there wasn't anyone else to do it. His ranch hand, a wiry young man named Pete Garfield, helped him dig, but Pete didn't say much. Pete had a habit of going quiet when things got serious, which Rowan had always appreciated. Silence was easier than the wrong words. 2 days later, a gelding named Copper started showing the same signs. Then a mare they called Three Spot. Then 2 more within the same week. By the 4th of July, Rowan had lost 6 horses. By the middle of July, 9. He'd sent for Doc Armand, the only veterinarian within 60 miles, a heavy-set man with thick hands and a kind face who smelled perpetually of pipe tobacco and liniment. Doc Armand had arrived on a Tuesday morning, examined 4 of the sick horses carefully and thoroughly, scratched his jaw for a long time, and said the words that made Rowan's stomach drop straight through the floor. "I don't rightly know what this is, Rowan." That was it. That was the whole verdict from the only man in the region who was supposed to know. Doc Armand had tried a tincture. It hadn't helped. He'd tried bloodletting, which Rowan hated but allowed because he was running out of objections. He'd recommended rest and separation and cool water, all the things Rowan was already doing. He'd come back twice more, looked at the animals with that same deep crease between his eyebrows, and eventually stopped coming because there was nothing left for him to offer, and they both knew it. "I'm sorry," Doc Armand had said the last time he rode out. He'd looked genuinely sorry. That somehow made it worse. The neighboring ranchers had started coming by around that time, which was how Rowan knew the situation had crossed some invisible line from bad to catastrophic. Men didn't visit unless they'd heard something worth visiting about. They came with offers of sympathy and second-hand remedies, and beneath all of it, a careful kind of assessment. The way men look at something they're already calculating the value of once it changes hands. Walt Deering had come by with a jar of his wife's rhubarb preserves and quietly offered to buy 3 of the healthy horses at fair price before things got worse. Rowan had thanked him for the preserves and shown him the gate. Harlan Price had stopped by twice, both times finding a reason to glance toward the stable and ask how many head Rowan had left standing. Rowan had answered both times with a number smaller than the last, and watched something sharpen in Harlan's eyes that he didn't like. But the worst had been Judge Carlton Hess. Hess wasn't a judge anymore. Hadn't been for nearly a decade, having lost his seat under circumstances that depended entirely on who you asked. But the title had stuck to him the way old titles do in small territories, out of habit and a vague, leftover respect. He owned land. He owned the only lumber mill within 30 miles. He was owed money by more people than he could probably name, which meant he was also owed favors, and Rowan Mercer was among those people. Rowan had borrowed against the ranch 2 years ago, after the drought of '87 had cut his grazing land down to a fraction of what it needed to be. He'd borrowed from Hess because Hess was the only man who would lend, and he'd done it knowing exactly what kind of arrangement it was. Not charity, not even business. A trap with a handshake on top of it. He hadn't been late on a payment, not once. But 3 months ago, Hess had produced a clause in the original agreement that Rowan couldn't remember signing. A clause that allowed Hess to demand full repayment within 90 days if the ranch's livestock value dropped below a certain threshold. Rowan's livestock value had been dropping every week since June. The 90 days were running out. He'd been standing in Hess's office when the man had laid it out. And the thing that had stuck in Rowan's memory wasn't the words or the document or even the smug, patient expression on Hess's face. It was the way Hess had poured himself a glass of whiskey during the conversation and never once offered Rowan one. Small cruelty. The kind that tells you everything. "Nothing personal," Hess had said, folding the papers back up with clean, careful hands. "Business is business, Mercer." "Business," Rowan had repeated, because he didn't trust himself to say anything else. He'd driven home through a dust cloud so thick he could barely see the road. And by the time he pulled into his own gate, he'd had exactly 2 thoughts clear enough to hold on to. The first was that he might actually lose this place. Might lose the land his father broke his back clearing, the house his father built board by board, the stable that still had his own name carved into one of the posts from when he was 11 years old, and thought that was a funny thing to do. The second thought was the letter he'd sent 6 weeks ago. He hadn't told anyone about the letter. Not Pete, not his neighbor Clara Finch, not the minister in town who sometimes stopped by with conversation Rowan didn't particularly want. The letter had been a private humiliation, and he'd mailed it on a gray morning when he was exhausted enough that his judgment had worn thin. It was an answer to a matrimonial advertisement in the Territorial Gazette. The advertisement had been small. 3 lines of careful language from a woman in Missouri who described herself as capable, hardworking, and unafraid of frontier conditions. The advertisement had been in the paper for 2 weeks before Rowan answered it, and he'd thrown away 4 drafts before he settled on one that didn't make him sound either desperate or dishonest. He'd settled, he thought, on something in between. He hadn't expected anything to come of it. Then a letter came back. Then another. Then, somehow, arrangements had been made. Through a frontier matchmaking service that handled such things with brisk, business-like efficiency. And there was a woman named Evelyn Hartwell scheduled to arrive on the afternoon train from Joplin on the 22nd of July. That was today. Rowan was standing in Dusty Creek's general store, holding a sack of feed he couldn't really afford, when Carlton Hess walked in with 2 of his men and did what he did with the boot and the paperwork and the laughter. Rowan didn't say anything. He paid for the feed. He walked out. He stood in the dusty street for a moment with the sack over his shoulder and the heat pressing down on him from every direction, and he thought about the fact that a woman he had never met was going to step off a train in approximately 2 hours and find whatever was left of a man named Rowan Mercer standing there to meet her. He almost didn't go. He thought about it seriously, standing there in that street. He thought about how unfair it was to bring someone into this, into the debt, the dying horses, the land that might not be his by fall. He thought about what kind of man does that to a stranger. He thought about writing to the matchmaking service and explaining that circumstances had changed, and he hoped Miss Hartwell would find a better situation. Then he thought about the ranch, and he thought about his father, and he thought about what it means to give up, and he put the feed sack in the back of the wagon and drove to the train station. The Dusty Creek Depot was a small, weathered building at the edge of town with a platform that had 3 loose boards and a water barrel that always smelled faintly of rust. There were 4 other people waiting when Rowan arrived, a family meeting a relative, from the looks of them, and a wire clerk who seemed to be there more out of boredom than necessity. Rowan tied his horse to the post and stood at the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in a slow, unconscious circle. He didn't know what she looked like. The letters had described a woman in her mid-30s, brown hair, medium height, from a farming family outside Joplin. Her writing had been neat and practical. She hadn't embellished or romanticized, which he'd appreciated. She'd asked straightforward questions about the land and the work and the living conditions, and she'd answered his questions the same way. She had said she was a hard worker. She had said she wasn't looking for luxury. She had said, in her 3rd letter, with what seemed like careful honesty, "I am not a woman who frightens easily, Mr. Mercer. I want you to know that before I come." He'd read that line 4 times. The train was 12 minutes late, which meant 12 minutes of standing on a loose-boarded platform in 94-degree heat, trying not to look like a man whose life was currently held together with fraying rope and determination. He watched a dust devil spin across the flats east of town. He watched a crow land on the water barrel and look at him with what he could only describe as judgment. He was not a man who talked to himself, but he said quietly to no one, "What exactly are you doing, Rowan?" It wasn't a question. It was more like an inventory. The train whistle reached them before the train did, that long, low sound that carried across flat country like nothing else. Then the locomotive came around the bend, trailing its plume of steam and iron smell, and the platform stirred to life around him, and Rowan Mercer put his hat back on his head and stood up straight and told himself that whatever came next, he would be honest with her. That was the only promise he could actually keep right now. Honesty. The passengers came off in a trickle. A salesman with 2 heavy cases, an older couple moving slowly, a young man in a wool jacket far too heavy for the weather. Rowan watched each of them with the particular focused attention of someone who doesn't know exactly who they're looking for. Then she came down the steps, and he knew, not because she matched any particular description, but because she was the only woman who stepped off that train alone, carrying a single weathered travel case, and looked directly at the surroundings with an expression that wasn't disappointment or excitement, but something more careful than either. Assessment. She was taking in what she'd arrived to. She was average height, as described. Brown hair pinned back practically under a plain hat. Somewhere in her mid-30s, with the kind of face that didn't look especially soft. Not hard either, but experienced, the word that came to Rowan without him searching for it. She wore a blue dress that had been good quality once and was still clean and well kept, and she carried herself with the straightness of someone who had learned not to let exhaustion show in her posture. She turned and found him before he'd taken 2 steps, which surprised him. He'd half expected to have to approach her awkwardly, but her eyes moved across the platform with the same practical efficiency with which she'd apparently assessed everything else, and they landed on him and stayed. He walked over, stopped at a respectful distance. "Miss Hartwell." "Mr. Mercer." She didn't extend her hand right away. She looked at him the way his description had looked at the territory, taking stock. Then, "You look like you've been having a bad month." He blinked. "A bad 2 months." "I can see that." She said it without cruelty, just an acknowledgement, the way someone says it looks like rain while looking at clouds. Then she extended her hand and he shook it, and her grip was firm and dry. "I appreciate you still coming." "Thought about not," he said, before he could stop himself. He didn't know why he said it. Honesty, he supposed. He'd made that promise, and apparently he was keeping it. She looked at him steadily. "So did I," she said. They stood there a moment in the heat and dust, 2 people who had made an unusual agreement under uncertain circumstances, and something passed between them that wasn't warmth exactly, but was the closest available thing, a mutual recognition of honesty in an unlikely place. "How many horses have you lost?" she asked. The question caught him sideways. Of all the things he'd expected her to say, about the journey, about the heat, about the nature of their arrangement, horses had not been in the running. 11, he said, out of 23. 4 more sick right now. She nodded slowly, and something shifted in her expression. Not alarm, which he might have expected, but a focused attention that looked almost clinical. "What are the symptoms?" "Fever. Trembling. They stopped drinking first, then eating. Then they go down and they don't get up. She was quiet for 3 seconds. He counted them without intending to. Is there a creek near the stable? She asked. 1/4 mile south. What grows along it? Willows? Any kind of mint? He stared at her. Yes. Both. Why? She looked at him again, and this time there was something else there. Something behind the practicality. Some interior calculation she wasn't yet sharing. Because I may have seen something like this before, she said carefully. I'm not certain. I need to see the horses first. She paused. I'm not promising anything, Mr. Mercer. I want to be clear about that. I appreciate that, he said, and he meant it. He picked up her travel case. She let him, but he noticed she didn't immediately relinquish it, held on for a half second as if checking herself, and walked her to the wagon. She climbed up without assistance, settling onto the bench with the unceremonious ease of someone who'd sat on 1,000 wagon benches. He untied the horse and came around and climbed up beside her. They pulled out of the Dusty Creek Depot onto the main road heading south, and for a 1/4 mile neither of them said anything. The heat settled over them like a hand. The road was rough where the summer had dried the ruts hard as brick, and the wagon jolted and creaked through all of it. Rowan cleared his throat. The house is clean, he said. I want you to know that, and you'll have your own room. Thank you. I don't know what your expectations were. They were practical, she said. I don't have romantic expectations, Mr. Mercer. I have practical ones. She looked at the road ahead. I expect to work. I expect honesty. I expect that if either of us decides this isn't working, we say so directly rather than making it miserable for everyone. A beat. I also expect that you tell me the truth about how bad things actually are, not the softened version. He glanced at her sideways. How bad do you want it? All of it? So he told her, the whole thing. The loan, the clause, the 90 days, Carlton Hess in that office with his whiskey glass and his clean hands, the 11 dead horses, Doc Armand's honest uselessness, the neighbors circling, the way the land felt different now than it had 2 months ago, like something had shifted in the ground underneath it. He talked for 20 minutes straight, which was the longest uninterrupted stretch of talking he'd done since his wife Margaret had died 3 years ago, and when he was done his voice felt dry and strange in his throat. Evelyn Hartwell had listened the whole time without interrupting once. Now she looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. That's a considerable amount of trouble, she said. Yes. Carlton Hess sounds like the kind of man who smells other people's difficulties the way a dog smells meat. Something unexpected moved through Rowan's chest. Not quite a laugh. Nothing had been funny for long enough that he wasn't sure he'd recognize one, but the shape of one. That's an accurate description. They exist everywhere, she said, with the weariness of someone saying something she knows from experience. Every county's got one. She was quiet again then. The horses, Mr. Mercer. That's where we start. Everything else follows from whether we can save the horses. He looked at her. We, he said. She met his eyes without hesitation. Yes, we. He turned back to the road. The ranch was visible now in the distance. The main house, the stable, the outbuildings. He knew what it looked like to him right now, hollowed out and exhausted. He wondered what it looked like to her, fresh off a train from Missouri, coming in with no history here and no attachment to what it had been. But then she said, quietly, almost to herself, there's still something here. You can see it. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't want to break it. Pete Garfield was waiting at the gate when they pulled in, because Pete had a way of materializing when something was happening, even when no one had told him anything was happening. He was 24, sunbaked, and had the slightly startled expression that seemed to be his permanent factory setting. He looked at Evelyn, looked at Rowan, looked back at Evelyn. This is Miss Hartwell, Rowan said. She'll be taking the back bedroom for now. Pete nodded, pulling off his hat with both hands like he'd been taught to do years ago and hadn't quite updated the habit since. Ma'am? He said seriously. Pete, Evelyn said, as if she'd known his name for years. She climbed down from the wagon before either of them could offer a hand, hit the ground solid, and looked toward the stable. Can I see them, the sick ones? Pete looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at Pete. Sure, Rowan said. She was already walking toward the stable door. Inside, the smell hit you immediately. The close, sick smell that had settled in over the past weeks, layered over the normal dust and hay and leather. Rowan had stopped noticing it. He noticed it now, through her, the way you notice a thing when you see someone else encountering it for the first time. Evelyn didn't react to the smell. She walked past the first two stalls where healthy horses stood watching, and she went straight to the far end where the four sick animals were kept separated. She stopped at the first stall and leaned over the low door and looked at the horse, a young bay gelding named Scout who'd been down for 2 days. And she was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised both Rowan and Pete. She climbed the stall door instead of opening it, swung over and crouched down beside the horse on the straw. She put one hand flat against his neck, then against his flank. She leaned close and looked at his eyes. She lifted his upper lip for a moment and examined his gums. Pete made a small sound next to Rowan that wasn't quite a word. She stayed down there for 3 full minutes, moving slowly, not alarming the animal. Scout, who had been too sick to respond to much of anything for 2 days, turned his head toward her incrementally, the way a suffering thing turns toward something that hasn't frightened it. Then Evelyn stood up, climbed back over the stall door, and faced them both. "I've seen this," she said. "My grandmother had a name for it. It's not what the veterinarian was treating." She pressed her lips together, working through something internal. Then, "The plant's along the creek. I need to go tomorrow at first light." "What do you think you can do?" Rowan asked. He didn't mean it dismissively. He wanted to understand. "I think I can slow this down," she said, which was more careful than stop it, and he respected that. "And if I'm right about what this is, if the pattern is what I think it is, I may be able to do more than that." She paused. "But I won't promise you something I can't deliver." He looked at her for a moment. This woman who'd arrived 2 hours ago, who'd stepped off a train into a stranger's catastrophe, and had not, at any point, appeared to be reconsidering. "I'll show you the creek at sunrise," he said. She nodded once. Then she turned and looked back into the dim stable, at the rows of stalls and the sick animals at the end, and her expression was harder to read now, something between determination and something he couldn't name. Something private. She was holding her travel case still. She hadn't let it out of her sight since she'd gotten off that train. He'd noticed that later. Right then, he was busy noticing that for the first time in 2 months, something on this ranch felt like it might be moving in a direction other than down. He didn't trust the feeling. He'd been wrong about too many things this summer, but he didn't dismiss it either. Outside, the afternoon sun was dropping toward the western ridge, painting everything in that specific Oklahoma gold that had always made Rowan think of his father, of better years, of what this land was supposed to become. Somewhere in the east, a single cloud was building, tall and purple at the edges. The kind of cloud that might mean rain in a week or tomorrow or tonight. In the last stall, the youngest sick horse stirred slightly on the straw and made a small sound. Not pain, something quieter. Something that might have been acknowledgement. Evelyn Hartwell heard it, Rowan noticed. She turned her head toward it briefly before she walked out of the stable into the fading light. She didn't say anything, but she heard it. And something in the way she heard it told Rowan Mercer that the woman who'd just arrived on the afternoon train from Joplin, Missouri, carrying her one weathered travel case, was not at all what anyone on this dying ranch had expected, including him. She was already gone when Rowan came downstairs the next morning. He'd set his intentions the night before to be up at 5, be at the creek by 5:30, show her where the willows grew thick along the south bend. He told himself this with the particular firmness of a man who'd been running on bad sleep for 2 months and kept setting intentions he barely managed to keep. He came down the stairs at 4:58, pulling his suspenders up over his shoulders, and found the back door already standing open and Evelyn Hartwell already gone. He stood there in his kitchen for a moment, looking at the open door. Her room door had been pulled shut. Her travel case was still inside. He could hear it wasn't there the way you hear the absence of something you've been unconsciously tracking. The coffee pot was on the stove. It was already hot. She'd made coffee before she left. At what hour, he couldn't say. He poured a cup, drank half of it standing at the back door looking out at the pale gray pre-dawn, then set the cup down and went to find her. She was at the creek already, and she'd been there long enough to have covered a serious stretch of the bank in both directions. He found her crouched at the water's edge, near the south bend, her skirt hem pinned up in some practical arrangement he didn't examine too closely, both hands working through the low growth along the waterline with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for and was simply confirming its location. Her boots were wet. She'd waded in at least once. He came down the bank and she didn't look up. "Willow's good," she said, as if they'd been mid-conversation. "There's more of it than I expected. The mint's here too, back about 20 feet from the bank where the soil's damp but not flooded. I found yarrow on the way down. There's a patch near the fence post. Did you know that?" "I knew something grew there," he said. "Yarrow." She stood up, brushing her hands on her apron. "And I need to look for something else. Plantain, the broad-leafed kind, not the fruit. It tends to grow where people walk, beaten ground, probably near the stable entrance or along the fence line." He looked at her in the growing light. Her hair wasn't fully pinned yet. She'd done it quickly, he guessed, in the dark. And there was already a smear of creek mud on her left forearm. She looked like someone who'd been working for an hour, because she had been. "You've been out here since when?" "Since I couldn't sleep," she said, which wasn't a precise answer. Which was when? She looked at him briefly. "Around 3. He absorbed this. "You walked down to the creek in the dark." "I had a lantern." She turned and started walking back along the bank, heading toward the fence line she'd mentioned. "Come show me where the stable entrance is from this direction. I want to see the approach." He followed her. He was still holding his hat, hadn't put it on yet, and he turned it in his hands the same way he had on the train platform the day before, that same unconscious circle. He made himself stop. "Evelyn." He said it before he'd decided to. She turned. "What's in the travel case?" She looked at him for 3 seconds, and he could see her deciding something. Not whether to lie, he didn't think she was that kind of woman, but how much, and in what order. "My grandmother's things," she finally said. "Some of them. Notes she made over 30 years of working with plants and animals. Dried samples, a few tools." She paused. She was what people in her county called a root woman, not a doctor, not a witch. The last word came out flat, like she was preempting something. A woman who knew what grew where, and what it did. "People believed in that?" he asked, and he meant it genuinely, not as a challenge. "Some did. Most didn't until they needed it." She turned and kept walking. "Same as anything." He walked beside her, and they found the broad-leafed plantain exactly where she'd predicted, growing in a thick, low carpet along the most used path between the stable and the water trough, beaten into the ground by years of boots and hooves, and no one ever noticing it was there. She crouched and touched the leaves, and something in her face settled into a quiet satisfaction. "Perfect," she said. "This is perfect. There's enough here." "Enough for what?" She stood. 4 horses, to start. If we do this right." She looked at the stable. "I want to begin today. I need a clean pot and a fire I can control. Do you have an outdoor grate?" "Behind the cookhouse." "Good, and I need no one to interfere while I work. No additions, no substitutions, no well-meaning suggestions from anyone who's heard about a remedy their uncle tried once." She said this in a tone that suggested she'd encountered that particular problem before. "Can you manage that?" "Pete means well," Rowan said. "I'm sure he does. Can you manage it?" "Yes," he said. What he hadn't anticipated was that managing Pete would be the least of his problems. Clara Finch arrived at 11 o'clock that same morning, which was slightly unusual. Clara generally came by on Thursdays, and this was a Tuesday. And she brought what she always brought, which was a basket of something from her garden and an appetite for information that she packaged as neighborly concern. She was 53, had lived on the adjacent property for 12 years, and had known Rowan since before Margaret died. She was not a bad woman. She was simply a woman who noticed things and could not rest until she'd discussed them with someone. She noticed Evelyn immediately. Evelyn was behind the cookhouse, tending a low fire under the outdoor grate with a pot of something that smelled green and medicinal and slightly bitter. She'd been at it since 8 in the morning. The travel case was open on the workbench beside her, and Rowan had caught one glimpse of its contents before she'd asked him, politely but firmly, to give her space. Small cloth packets of dried material, a leather-bound notebook with pages so worn the corners had gone soft, a few glass bottles sealed with wax, some tools he didn't have names for. Clara came around the corner of the cookhouse with her basket and stopped short. "Well," she said. Evelyn looked up without alarm. "Good morning," she said. She turned back to the pot and made a small adjustment to the fire. Clara looked at Rowan, who was leaning against the cookhouse wall, maintaining what he hoped was an expression of complete normalcy. "Is this—" Clara began, and then switched directions the way she sometimes did when she was recalibrating. "Are you Rowan's?" "Evelyn Hartwell," Evelyn said. "I arrived yesterday." "She answered the advertisement," Rowan said. Clara set her basket down on the nearest flat surface and gave Rowan a look that communicated, without any words at all, that she had not known about any advertisement, and that she felt this was information she should have been given earlier, and that there were going to be further questions about this at a future time. "I see," she said. Then she looked at the pot. "What is that?" "Medicine," Evelyn said. "For the horses?" "Yes." Clara looked at Rowan again. Rowan looked at his boots. There was a pause that had some weight to it. "Doc Armand couldn't do anything," Clara said gently, "the way you say something you think a person may not have fully accepted yet." "I know that," Evelyn said. She didn't say it sharply. She said it the way you say something that is simply true and requires no elaboration. Clara Finch was not accustomed to being answered that way. She was quiet for a moment, reassessing. Then she picked her basket back up and handed it to Rowan. "I brought tomatoes," she said, "and 2 jars of the sweet corn relish." She looked at Evelyn one more time. A different kind of look now, more evaluating than skeptical. "Do you need anything?" Evelyn glanced up. The look that passed between the two women was brief and somewhat unreadable. "A second pot? If you have one you don't mind loaning," Clara nodded slowly. "I'll bring it Thursday," she said. "Tomorrow would be better." Another pause. Then, surprisingly, Clara almost smiled. "Tomorrow," she agreed, and she left. Pete appeared at Rowan's elbow approximately 30 seconds after Clara's wagon cleared the gate. "What is she making?" he asked in a tone that tried to be casual and wasn't. "Medicine," Rowan said. "Does it smell like that on purpose?" "Pete?" "Right." Pete retreated toward the stable. The first treatment went into the sick horses that afternoon. Rowan watched from the stable doorway because Evelyn had asked him to stay back, but watching was permitted. She moved through the stalls methodically, not rushing, not performing. She worked the way practical people work, which is to say she worked like the work was all that mattered, and she was not thinking about being observed. She'd prepared the treatment in 3 stages over the course of the day, each stage involving different combinations of what she'd gathered from the creek and the fence line, and the result looked like something between tea and broth, dark green and slightly thick, with a smell that cut through even the sick animal heaviness of the stable air. Getting a horse that doesn't want to drink something is not a graceful process. Scout was the worst of the 4. He was down and had been for 2 days, and getting him to take any liquid required Evelyn to sit beside him on the straw for 20 minutes, offering the liquid slowly, talking to him in a low and steady voice that Rowan strained to hear from the doorway but couldn't quite make out. It was not medical language. It wasn't anything identifiable. It was just sound. Steady, unhurried sound. And Scout's ears, which had been flat against his head when she'd entered the stall, gradually moved toward her the way antennae will move toward a signal. He took the liquid. Not all of it, but enough. She did the same with the other 3. It took the better part of 2 hours, and when she came out of the last stall, she was tired. Rowan could see it in the way she moved her shoulders, the way she let herself lean for a moment against the stable wall before she straightened back up. "Now we see," she said. "How long?" he asked. She looked at him honestly. "I don't know. In the cases I saw with my grandmother, sometimes 24 hours, sometimes 3 days, and sometimes—" She stopped. "Sometimes it doesn't work," he finished. She met his eyes. "Yes." He nodded. There was something oddly relieving about a person who wouldn't dress that up for him. "Rowan." She said his name for the first time without the Mr. in front of it, and he didn't think she'd intended to because she paused after it briefly. If this doesn't work, it won't be because the knowledge was wrong. It'll be because I'm not my grandmother, and this territory isn't Missouri, and I may have gaps I don't know I have. She pressed her mouth together. I want you to know I understand that. I know you do, he said. I'm telling you so you're not blindsided. I know. He looked at the stable door. I've been blindsided enough this summer that I'd appreciate the warning. He glanced back at her. But you're here. You're trying. That's more than what was happening before you arrived. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully decode. Not quite gratitude, something quieter than that, something that had a complicated history behind it. Not everyone would say that, she said. Then they're idiots, Rowan said simply, and went to help Pete with the evening feeding. That night was the hardest kind of waiting, the particular torture of not knowing, of having done the thing that might help, and now having nothing left to do but let time make its decision. Rowan sat on the porch after supper and watched the darkness settle over the land. The healthy horses moved in the paddock, their shapes shifting in and out of what little moonlight came through the cloud cover. He could hear the creek from here. He usually liked that sound. Tonight, it just reminded him that time was passing. Evelyn came out at some point, he wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there, and she brought 2 cups of actual coffee, which meant she'd made a fresh pot inside without being asked. She set one beside him on the porch rail without comment and sat down on the step below, which he understood as the posture of someone who wasn't trying to start a conversation but wasn't closed to one either. You think about her? She asked after a while. He looked down at the back of her head. Who? She turned slightly. Your wife. Margaret. A beat. I'm sorry, you mentioned her in one of your letters, only once. He looked back at the paddock. Yes, he said, especially when things are bad. He paused. Not in a... He searched for the right word and didn't find it immediately. Not in a grieving way anymore. More like consulting. Like I'm running through what she would have said. What would she have said? He thought about it. Really thought about it. The way you can sometimes when you're tired enough that the defenses come down. She would have said I was doing too much thinking and not enough sleeping. Evelyn made a small sound that was close to a laugh. She sounds like she was sensible. She was the most sensible person I've ever known. He looked at his coffee. She would have liked you, he added, and then wished immediately that he hadn't, because it sounded presumptuous and possibly strange, the kind of thing you say without thinking that creates awkwardness you then have to manage. But Evelyn just said, "Thank you," and it didn't seem awkward. She seemed to take it for what it was, which was a genuine thing said without calculation. They sat in the dark for a while longer, and then she went inside, and Rowan stayed another hour on the porch before finally going to bed, where he slept badly, but slept. In the morning, Scout was still down. So were 2 of the other 3. The 4th sick horse, a 5-year-old mare named Rue, was standing. She was standing on all 4 legs in her stall, not strongly. She had her head low and was not interested in food yet. But she was standing, which she had not been doing the previous afternoon. Rowan found her when he went into the stable at 6, and he stood at her stall door for a full minute just looking at her. Pete came in behind him and stopped. She's standing, Rowan said. Pete exhaled. Just that. One long, slow exhale, like something he'd been holding for weeks. Evelyn came down from the house 15 minutes later and went straight to the stalls without stopping at the house first. When she saw Rue, she checked her the same way she'd examined all 4 horses that first day. Eyes, gums, neck, flank. And when she straightened up, she was very still for a moment, and the expression on her face was one Rowan thought he would remember. It was not triumph. It was something more private than that. Something between relief and grief. The way you feel when a thing you believed in is confirmed, and you realize how much you'd been afraid it wouldn't be. She put her hand flat against Rue's neck. Rue turned her head slightly and tolerated it. All right, Evelyn said very quietly. To the horse, not to anyone else. She retreated, and Rowan followed her out. The others? He asked. Too soon to say, she said. But Rue is responding. That means the treatment isn't wrong. She pressed her hands together. I need to make more. A stronger preparation for Scout and for the others. and I need to go back to the creek. There's one more thing I want to try if I can find enough of it." "What thing?" She hesitated, and he'd learned already in one day that her hesitations were real ones, not performances. She wasn't stalling, she was genuinely deciding. "There's a route my grandmother used in the worst cases," she said finally. "I didn't bring it because I wasn't sure I'd find it here. But I think I saw it yesterday, further up the creek bank. If it's what I think it is—" She stopped. "I need to see it in full light before I'm sure." "I'll come with you," he said. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." He picked up his hat from the fence post. "I want to." They walked the creek bank in the morning light, further north than she'd gone the day before, where the bank rose and the willows gave way to older, denser growth. She moved with her eyes down, covering ground methodically, and he walked slightly behind and to the side and stayed quiet, because it was clear that this was her working, and the kindest thing he could do was not make her manage him at the same time. She stopped, crouched, looked at something growing at the base of a small incline where the soil stayed damp year-round. "Is that it?" he asked. "Maybe." She reached down and pinched a small piece of leaf and rubbed it between her fingers and brought it to her nose. She stayed there for 5 full seconds with her eyes closed. He watched her face carefully, that same assessment she'd done at the train station, except pointed inward now. Her own memory, her own knowledge, some internal conversation he wasn't part of. She opened her eyes. "Yes," she said. "Good?" "Very good." She sat back on her heels and looked at the plant with an expression he could only describe as affectionate. "My grandmother called it creek valerian, but that's not its proper name. She said it was the thing she reached for when nothing else had held." She started gathering it carefully, taking leaves and some of the root, but leaving the plant intact, the way someone does when they intend to come back. She said her mother taught her about it. Her mother's mother taught it to her before that. "That's a long line of women who knew things," Rowan said. Evelyn glanced up at him. "Yes," she said. Something in her voice had shifted. Looser, less guarded. "Most of them were told not to use it, not to talk about it. You know how that goes." He did know, in a general way. He thought about the way Doc Armand had looked when Rowan had first cautiously mentioned that his wife had some knowledge of plant remedies. The polite, patient skepticism of a man who had scientific training and no ill will, and still, reflexively, could not quite believe that a woman with dried plants in a suitcase knew something he didn't. "Must be frustrating," Rowan said, meaning the whole long history of it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, still gathering. "It builds character," she said, which was wry enough that he recognized it as armor and didn't push further. They walked back with her apron full and the morning heating up around them, and somewhere in the middle of that walk, without either of them noting or marking it, the stiffness between them, the formal distance of 2 strangers who'd agreed to something large and uncertain, had become something different, not familiar yet, but moving toward it, the way the light moves toward noon. The next 2 days were not triumphant. Scout got worse before he got better. He was the one Rowan had been most worried about from the beginning. He was younger than the others, which should have been in his favor, but the fever had hit him harder, and on the second night he went into a shaking that was terrible to watch, a deep, full-body trembling that shook the straw around him. Evelyn spent most of that night in his stall, and Rowan brought her coffee twice and blankets once, and didn't ask her to come inside because the look on her face when she was working told him clearly that she wasn't going to. At 2 a.m, Rowan was sitting outside Scout's stall on an upended bucket, trying not to fall asleep, when Evelyn said without turning around, "You don't have to stay." "I know." A silence. "I'm not going to suddenly figure out something new if you're watching," she said. "Not unkindly, honestly." "I know that too," he said. Another silence. Then, "Are you one of those people who can't be alone when things are bad?" He thought about it. "I used to be able to," he said. "After Margaret died, I got better at it, whether I wanted to or not." A beat. "I think right now I'm staying because—" He stopped. "Because," she prompted, "because if Scout doesn't make it, I don't want you to have been alone for that either," he said. A long quiet followed that. He couldn't see her face from where he was sitting. He heard her shift on the straw, heard her hands moving, the small sounds of her work. "That's a decent thing to say," she said finally, and went back to work. Scout did not die that night. By the following morning, his shaking had stopped. By afternoon, he was taking water on his own. Not much. Careful sips, the tentative drinking of an animal still not sure it trusts its own body, but on his own. Evelyn stood at the stall door and watched him, and said nothing. Rowan stood beside her. After a while he said, "3 of the 4 are standing now." "Yes." "The 4th is responding, even if she's slow." "Yes." He looked at her. She looked at Scout, who was drinking again, slowly. The light from the stable's open east door was coming in at the angle it always came at this hour, falling across the hay and the dust and all of it. "Evelyn," she turned. "What you're doing here?" He stopped. He was not a man who found this easy, this kind of direct thing, the naming of something that was happening. Margaret had always said he had feelings like pockets. He had them, you just had to know where to look and be willing to reach. "I haven't said it clearly enough. What you're doing here is remarkable." She looked at him with those even, assessing eyes, and he thought she was going to deflect it the way people do when they don't know how to receive something. But she didn't. She took it. "I'm doing what I know," she said. "I'm just doing it somewhere new." "That's what I mean," he said. She turned back to the horses. "The ones I couldn't save were the ones that stayed with me longest," she said after a moment. "My grandmother's too. The ones that made it through, you remember them, you're glad. But the ones you lose?" She didn't finish. "I know," Rowan said. "I'm not going to lose these," she said, and it wasn't bravado. It was the quiet, fierce statement of a woman who was making herself a promise, not him. He understood the difference. He would have left it there, let that moment stand on its own. Then Pete came through the stable door at something between a jog and a run, which Pete almost never did, and both of them turned because Pete moving with urgency was a signal worth heeding. "Rider coming," Pete said, slightly out of breath. "From the North Road." Rowan felt something tighten across his chest. There was only one person who regularly came from the North Road with the kind of speed that made Pete run. "Hess?" he said. Pete nodded. Rowan straightened. He looked at Evelyn. She'd turned from the stall, reading the shift in the air with the same quickness she seemed to read everything. He said nothing to her, just walked out of the stable toward the gate, putting his hat on as he went. Carlton Hess sat on a good horse, accompanied by one of his men, a heavy-set fellow named Doyle, who seemed to serve primarily as a presence, a way of adding weight to whatever Hess was saying. Hess himself looked the same as he always looked, well-dressed for a man who spent most of his time intimidating people, with the particular comfort of someone who has never seriously worried about losing. He stopped his horse at Rowan's gate and looked down. "Heard you had a woman come in," he said. "Heard she's been doing something with your horses." "That's not your business," Rowan said. "No, not that specifically." Hess turned his hat brim slightly, an idle gesture. "Though it does speak to the condition of the livestock, which is my business, given our arrangement." He looked toward the stable. "How many you got left standing, Mercer?" "Enough." Hess made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "See, I've been hearing numbers that don't support that. I've been hearing you're down to maybe 12 healthy animals and 4 that might not make it through the week." "You've been hearing wrong," Rowan said, and he meant it, and the meaning of it, that for the first time in 2 months, that statement was actually close to true, did something to the temperature in his chest. Hess looked at him steadily. Hess was good at that, the long, comfortable look of a man who wasn't worried about time. "The 90 days runs out in 3 weeks, Rowan," he said. "I want to make sure you have a clear picture of where things stand." "I have a clear picture," Rowan said. "Good." Hess gathered his reins. "Because I'd hate for there to be any—" He paused, tasting the next word like something he was enjoying. "Confusion." He looked toward the stable one more time, and something moved behind his eyes, a calculation. "Heard she came to marry you." Rowan said nothing. "Mail order arrangement?" Hess continued. "Long way to come for a ranch that might not—" "Carlton." Rowan said his name with a flatness that cut through whatever the next word was going to be. He'd never called him Carlton before. He'd always called him Judge. The absence of it landed. "Get off my gate!" A beat. Hess looked at him in a way he hadn't looked at him before. a slight recalibration, as if he'd seen something in Rowan Mercer's face that wasn't usually there and was factoring it into the math. Then he turned his horse without another word and rode back up the north road with Doyle behind him, and the dust settled slowly in the still morning air. Rowan stood at the gate for a moment after they were gone. He heard footsteps on the path behind him and knew without turning it was Evelyn. He heard fast, she said. This is a small territory, Rowan said. Word travels faster than riders. She stood beside him, looking at the empty road. 3 weeks, she said. Yes. The horses will be well before 3 weeks, she said, and she said it with a certainty that wasn't careless. It was the certainty of someone who'd seen Rue standing and Scout drinking, and the fourth mare beginning to take interest in her feed that morning for the first time in a week. If they are, Rowan began. When they are, she said. He looked at her sideways. She was still watching the empty road with that particular expression he was starting to recognize. Eyes slightly narrowed, jaw set, the face of a woman who had already made up her mind and was simply waiting for the situation to catch up with her. Something in him shifted. He didn't name it then. He filed it away, the way you file something you aren't ready to look at directly. When they are, he agreed. He turned back toward the stable and she walked beside him, and for a moment the only sounds were their boots on the dry ground and somewhere in the paddock, one of the healthy horses making a sound that carried easily across the morning air, a full, strong, living sound that was the opposite of the sounds the stable had been full of for 2 months. 3 weeks, Rowan thought. 3 weeks to turn what was beginning to look like a corner into something Hess couldn't argue with, couldn't calculate away, couldn't grind under his boot heel in a general store and call it nothing. He had 12 healthy horses and 4 recovering ones, and a woman who had come from Missouri with a weathered travel case and knowledge that went back further than Doc Armand's diplomas, and right now, standing in the morning light of a ranch that had been dying 24 hours before she arrived, that was what he had, and he was going to work with it. Behind them, in the stable, Scout pressed his nose against the water bucket and drank 3 long, slow pulls. Neither of them saw it. But Pete did, and Pete, a young man not much given to demonstrating his feelings, quietly put his hand on the stall door and stayed there with it for a moment, and didn't say anything to anyone about it for the rest of the day, and that was its own kind of answer. The week that followed Carlton Hess's visit was the strangest kind of week, the kind where bad things stop getting worse but haven't yet started getting better, and you're suspended in the middle of that, not trusting the stillness. Scout stood up on a Thursday. Not on his own. He needed Pete's help and a length of rope looped under his chest for support, and the first time they tried it, he went back down after 30 seconds and lay there breathing hard with his legs splayed, and Rowan crouched beside him and felt the particular despair of a man watching something fight and not quite make it. But the second time, 40 minutes later, Scout found his legs. Shaky, uncertain legs that trembled under him like a new foal's, but legs that held. He stood there in the stall with his head low and his sides heaving, and Rowan kept his hand on the horse's neck and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. Evelyn was watching from the stall door. She had a cup of coffee in both hands, and she was watching with the careful attention of someone who isn't celebrating yet. "Is he over it?" Pete asked her. "He's through the worst," she said, which was not the same thing, and Pete understood the difference, because Pete had been in that stable with all of them long enough to understand the distinction she made. "He needs another week of the treatment, lighter preparation now, and he needs to eat." "He won't eat," Rowan said, still crouching beside Scout. "Hasn't touched grain in 4 days." "I know." She set her cup on the post. "Move back a little." Rowan moved. She came into the stall and sat down cross-legged in the straw next to the horse, just sat the way she did, without ceremony. And she put her hand flat on his jaw and just kept it there. Scout's ear swiveled toward her. She started talking in that low, unhurried voice, and this time Rowan didn't strain to hear the words because he'd understood by now that the words weren't the point. The steadiness was the point. The refusal to communicate alarm or urgency or desperation, all the things Scout could read off a human as easily as reading weather. After about 5 minutes, she reached into her apron pocket and brought out something small. He couldn't see what it was from where he stood, and held it near Scout's nose. The horse's nostrils moved. He turned his head slightly, and then, tentatively, his lips moved. Dried apple, she said, without looking up. Soaked in the willow preparation. He doesn't know it's medicine. Scout ate the piece of apple. Then he ate another. Pete made his sound, that specific exhale, and Rowan straightened up from where he'd been bracing himself against the stall wall without realizing he'd done it. That's something, Rowan said. It's a start, Evelyn said. She was still sitting in the straw, still calm, and Scout was nosing at her hand looking for more apple, which was the first interest in anything he'd shown in 5 days. We'll do this 3 times a day until he wants grain again. Shouldn't be long now. Shouldn't be long. She said it practically, as a simple forecast, the way you say the weather ought to turn by Friday. But Rowan had come to know, in the particular compressed education of the past 10 days, that what sounded simple in her voice had usually been preceded by hours of work and judgment and consultation with a dead woman's notebooks that she still hadn't shown him and that he hadn't asked to see. The notebooks were the one thing she kept to herself. Everything else she explained, at least partially, when he asked. The plants, the preparations, the reasons behind the sequencing. She wasn't secretive about the knowledge itself. But the notebooks she kept in the travel case, which lived in her room now, and she took them out in the evenings and read by the lamp, and he'd seen her writing in them once through the open door, adding something in a hand smaller and more cramped than her regular writing, which he'd noticed was already precise. He hadn't asked. It felt like the wrong kind of intrusion. What he had asked, about a week after she arrived, was how she'd learned to do what she was doing. Not the grandmother, not the inheritance. He knew that part. The actual mechanics of it, the learning. They'd been sitting at the table after supper, which had become a thing they did, not deliberately, not by agreement, but because neither of them seemed particularly drawn to eating quickly and leaving. The dishes were done, Pete had gone to his bunk, and there was that quiet particular to nighttime in open country, where the sounds are far away and the lamp makes a small world that contains just what's inside it. My grandmother started teaching me when I was 8, Evelyn had said. She was tracing a pattern on the tabletop with one finger, not looking at him, in the way of someone accessing memory by not looking directly at it. Not as lessons, just I was with her when she worked. I carried things. I watched. She'd tell me what something was called and why while she was using it, but it wasn't a school. It was just her life, and I was in it. Did your mother know? He asked. Something crossed Evelyn's face. My mother thought it was old women's foolishness, she said, and the phrasing was careful in the way that careful phrasing usually signals an old wound handled many times. She was a practical woman. She believed in what she could see a result from quickly. A pause. She died before she got to see her mother's results. Or mine. I'm sorry, Rowan said. They both died before... She stopped herself, started again differently. I spent a long time after my grandmother passed not using what she taught me, because the people who saw me use it in Joplin, she pressed her lips together. In a city it looks different than it does out here. In a city it looks strange, suspicious. I had a neighbor's child once, a sick child, and I helped, and the child was better in 3 days, and the child's father told people I'd done something unnatural. She said the word with a precision that made it clear she was choosing the more neutral version of what the man had actually said. That was 5 years ago, and I still felt it when I wrote to you. Rowan looked at her. Why did you write then? She met his eyes. Because my grandmother told me one thing consistently, from the time I was 8 until the week before she died. She said, the knowledge only matters if you use it. She said the worst thing she could imagine was dying and having it all die with her unused. A beat. I was close to that. I was close to just not using it anymore. And then I saw your advertisement, and you described a horse ranch in the territory, and I thought about what my grandmother would have said. What would she have said? She would have told me to get on the train, Evelyn said simply. Rowan thought about that. Then he said, I'm glad she would have said that. Evelyn looked at him a moment. So am I, she said, and she got up and went to her room, and he sat at the table a while longer in the good quiet. The fourth sick horse, the slowest one, a 7-year-old gray mare called Pepper, pulled all the way through on a Saturday, 11 days after Evelyn arrived. Rowan wasn't there when it happened. He was repairing the fence on the east pasture when Pete came running. Actually running this time, a full sprint that said clearly this was not a situation to walk, and shouted something Rowan couldn't hear over the wind, then got close enough to say it plain. "Pepper ate," Pete said, breathing hard. "On her own, from the bucket." Rowan dropped the fence pliers in the grass and walked fast back to the stable, and when he got there, all 4 of the sick horses were standing. Scout still moved carefully, like a man walking on ice, but he was walking. Rue had gained back a visible amount of weight in the past week, and her eyes were bright. 3-Spot, who hadn't been sick as long as the others, was pressing against her stall door with the impatience of an animal that wanted out, and Pepper was standing at her bucket eating grain. Slowly, deliberately, one mouthful at a time, as if she was reminding herself how it worked. Evelyn was at the far end of the stable when Rowan came in. She had her back to him, and she was standing at Pepper's stall, and she wasn't doing anything, just standing with her arms crossed loosely over her apron, watching the horse eat. He came up beside her, and they both stood there in silence, watching Pepper eat grain from a bucket. After a while, Evelyn said, without looking at him, "4 for 4? 4 for 4, he said. She uncrossed her arms. He saw her wipe her hand quickly across her face, once, fast, the motion of someone who doesn't want to be observed doing it. He looked at the horse. "Your grandmother would have been proud," he said. She didn't respond for a moment. Then, "Yes," she said, "I think she would." He wanted to say more. He had things that were asking to be said, about what these 11 days had meant, about what kind of person does what she'd done, about the word remarkable that he'd used once before and which seemed more inadequate every day. He didn't say any of them. He had a feeling she knew, and that saying them would make her uncomfortable in a way she'd worked to conceal, and he'd come to respect her enough not to put her through that. So he just stood there with her while the horse ate. That evening, he went into Dusty Creek for supplies, and word had apparently already moved faster than his wagon. Walt Deering stopped him on the street and said he'd heard the horses were coming around, and his face had the particular expression of a man revising a calculation he'd thought was settled. Harlan Price nodded at him from across the street with something that looked, if he was reading it correctly, like respect, or at least like the beginning of it. And in the general store, the man behind the counter, whose name was Frank Odell and who served simultaneously as postmaster, hardware vendor, and the territory's most reliable distributor of information, told Rowan without being asked that he'd had 3 people in that day asking about the woman who'd saved the Mercer horses. "People are curious," Frank said, stacking tins with the unhurried pace of a man comfortable in his role as information hub. "Let them be curious," Rowan said. "Walt Deering's mare has had a cough for 2 weeks, Frank offered. Rowan paid for his flour and his salt and his coffee and carried them to the wagon, and on the way home he thought about what it meant that the name of the Mercer Ranch had gone, in 11 days, from a thing people said with the careful sympathy reserved for the doomed, to a thing they were saying with something else, something closer to what it had been before the summer of 1889 had taken a hammer to everything. He didn't share any of that with Evelyn when he got home. She was at the outdoor grate with a new preparation, not for the sick horses this time, but a maintenance treatment for the 4 recovering ones, and she had her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming loose from its pin on one side, and she looked busy in the focused, purposeful way that he'd come to understand was her default state. He unloaded the wagon. He made supper. She came in when the food was ready, washed her hands at the pump, sat down. "Frank Odell says people are asking about you," he said, setting a plate in front of her. She looked at her plate. "What kind of asking?" "The kind where they have sick animals and they've heard something." She was quiet. She picked up her fork. "I'm not a veterinarian," she said. "I know that. I can't promise results the way a business promises results. I know. And I have—" she paused. "I have gaps. Things my grandmother knew that I didn't fully learn, or that I learned wrong, or that don't translate to this territory's plans. I'm not—" She pressed the fork against her plate lightly. "People are going to expect what happened here to happen every time, and it won't. It can't. I'm not suggesting you set up a practice," Rowan said. "I'm telling you what I heard." She looked at him. "What are you suggesting?" He thought about it. "Nothing yet," he said honestly. "I just thought you should know." She went back to eating. He did too. After a while, she said, "Walt Deering's mare." He looked up. "Frank told you?" "Frank told you, and I saw it in your face when you came in," she said. Not unkindly. She had a way of saying things that should have been sharp, but somehow weren't, because there was no malice in them. They were just accurate. "What are the symptoms?" "Cough. Some loss of appetite, I think." She nodded slowly, thinking. "I'd need to see her." "I know." "I won't promise Walt Deering anything." "He'd be glad of the looking," Rowan said. "I know, Walt." Evelyn picked up her coffee. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow, if you can arrange it." He could, and did. And the day after that, Evelyn Hartwell looked at Walt Deering's bay mare in his barn on the north side of his property, while Walt stood in the barn entrance with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man braced for bad news. And she examined the horse for 15 minutes and asked Walt careful questions about the cough. When it happened, how often, whether it was worse in the morning, whether anything had changed in the feed recently. And when she was done, she turned to Walt and said the mare wasn't critically ill, but that something in her feed was irritating her lungs, and she'd like to see what he was using. Walt showed her. It was a batch of hay he'd bought from a new supplier 2 weeks ago. She looked at it for a long moment, turned some of it over in her hands, and said there was likely mold in it, low level, not visible, but affecting the horse's airways. She told him to pull the hay, air out the barn, and she'd send over a preparation with Rowan in 2 days that would help the mare's lungs recover. Walt looked at her with the expression of a man who has been worried about something for 2 weeks and has just been told it's fixable. "How much do I owe you?" he said. "Nothing," Evelyn said. "That's not—" "Nothing this time," she said. "Let me see if it works first." Walt Deering looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at Evelyn. She was already walking back toward the wagon. It worked. 3 days later, Walt Deering's mare had stopped coughing. Walt came by the ranch personally to say so, and he brought a smoked ham, which he said was not payment, just a gift between neighbors, and Evelyn accepted it on those terms without argument, and the ham lasted a week and was excellent. And then things began happening in a way that didn't feel orchestrated, but was, looking back, probably inevitable. The widow Callum's 2 goats, sick with something that had stopped them eating. A rancher from 7 miles east named Tully Bright, with a mule that had gone lame in a way Doc Armand couldn't diagnose. A family with chickens dying one by one from something that moved through the coop like a slow fire. All of them came, and not all of them she could help. She turned away 2 cases and said so plainly, told them what she couldn't do and why and where she thought they might have better luck. But most of them she could offer something, and most of the things she offered worked. She never promised. She always explained what she was doing and why, as much as she could, to whoever was asking. She turned away the ones she couldn't help rather than trying and risking. And she would not take payment, which became the source of the only real argument she and Rowan had in those 3 weeks. He brought it up on a Thursday evening, which was, it turned out, the wrong evening for it. He'd watched her spend the previous day treating a family's chickens for free and come home tired, and he'd been thinking about it while he repaired a section of stable roof that had gone soft. And when they sat down to supper, he said carefully that he thought she should be charging something. Not much. Something. Evelyn set down her fork. She did it carefully, which he was learning meant she was managing an impulse that was less careful. "Why?" she said. "Because your time is worth something," he said. "Because you're doing real work." "I know it's real work," she said. "I'm the one doing it." "I'm not saying you don't." "The moment I take money," she said, with a patience that had a short bottom to it, "I become accountable in a different way. People expect more when they pay. They expect certainty. And I told you already, I don't have certainty. I have knowledge, and I have effort, and I have a grandmother's notebooks, and that is not the same as certainty." She picked her fork back up. "I know what I'm doing, Rowan." "I know you do," he said. You're thinking about the debt," she said. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. "The money we'd get from me charging people would be a small fraction of what we owe Hess, and you know that, so it's not really about the money." She paused. "You're worried about the deadline, and you're looking for ways to do something because not doing something is terrible, and I understand that. He sat there and the accuracy of it hit him somewhere uncomfortable. He wanted to argue with it and couldn't. "You're not wrong," he said. "I know I'm not," she said without triumph. 2 weeks, Rowan. 2 weeks until Hess's deadline. We have 16 horses standing, 4 of them fully recovered. You know what that's worth." "If I can sell—" "We," she said. He looked at her. "We," she repeated, and there was something in her voice that was different from the practical we she'd said in their first week, the collaborative we of 2 people addressing a shared problem. This was something else, something quieter and more settled. "If we can sell a few head at fair market price before the deadline, what does that get us?" He'd run the numbers in his head enough times that he had them ready. "Maybe halfway," he said. "Maybe a little more. If the buyers know the horses are recovered and healthy." "And the land? What about it?" "What's the Eastern Quarter worth on its own?" she asked. He stared at her. "You're suggesting I sell off part of the—" "I'm asking what it's worth," she said. "I didn't say sell it." He thought. "It's good grassland. Somebody would pay." He named a figure. Evelyn did mental arithmetic that she didn't share the steps of. "Then, could we pay Hess in full with the horses and the Eastern Quarter?" "Evelyn, I'm not selling part of my land to Carlton." "I didn't say sell it to Carlton Hess," she said, with a patience that was starting to sound like the patience of someone who has run several steps ahead in a conversation and is waiting for the other person to arrive. "I said, could we pay him in full?" He worked it out. Grudgingly. And yes, if he sold 3 horses at strong prices and sold the Eastern Quarter to a good buyer, not Hess, someone who wouldn't turn it into leverage, he could clear the debt. He could end the arrangement entirely. He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about this since I got on the train," she said. He didn't know what to say to that. The woman who'd arrived 11 days ago, not knowing if the horses would live, had been working on the financial problem at the same time. He'd been so consumed with the animals, with watching her work, with the daily emergencies of the stable, that he'd let the business end of things grow dim in his mind. The way you do when you're in survival mode, and you can only attend to what's immediately on fire. She'd been attending to it in the background, without telling him, without waiting for him to ask. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" he asked. She looked at him with something that was almost impatience, but wasn't quite. "Because until the horses were standing, there was nothing to say." She picked up her coffee. "Now there is." He leaned back in his chair. Outside, the wind had picked up in the last hour. He'd noticed it while he was cooking, a shift from the south that felt different from the evening breezes they'd been having. Something in it. He didn't name it then. "The Eastern Quarter," he said. "Jesse Toll would buy it," Evelyn said. "He mentioned when he came by with his mule that he'd been looking to expand." "You discussed this with Tully Bright?" "I listened while he talked," she said. "He brought it up." She set her cup down. "People talk freely when they think you're only thinking about their animals." Rowan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something he hadn't planned to say. "What did you do before this? In Joplin? What did you actually do?" She looked at him calmly. "I kept books for 3 businesses," she said. "I raised my sister's children for 2 years when she was sick. I helped my grandmother when she was dying. And I grew a garden that fed 6 people through 2 bad winters." She paused. "I did a great many things, Rowan. None of them involved sitting still." He absorbed this. He thought about the letter that had been 3 lines in a newspaper, and the response he'd written in 4 drafts, and the chain of events that had ended with this woman sitting across his supper table calmly explaining to him how to save his ranch. "I think I may have underestimated what I was writing to," he said. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. "Most people do," she said. "It's fine. They usually figure it out." The wind hit harder against the kitchen window, and both of them looked at it without comment. The lamp flame bent sideways for a moment and then righted itself. Rowan said, "That wind's changed." Evelyn had already stood up from the table and was moving to the window, and she looked out at the sky to the northwest, and what she saw there made her go still in a way that communicated itself to him immediately, the stillness of someone whose attention has been seized completely. The sky to the northwest was the color that meant business. Not the purple of an ordinary evening storm, but a deep, moving green-black that boiled at the edges. The kind of sky that Oklahoma Territory people learned early to take seriously because the ones who didn't sometimes didn't get to learn from it. "How far?" she asked. He came to the window, looked. His stomach went cold in the specific way it went cold when the situation had just changed categories. "Hour," he said. "Maybe less. It's moving fast." "The horses?" "Already thinking it," he said, because he was. Because the question wasn't whether to bring the horses in, but which horses first and whether the stable roof he'd been patching would hold, and whether the south paddock gate would latch in high wind because the latch had been temperamental since May. He was pulling on his jacket before he'd finished the thought. Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway. Pete's room was above the cookhouse, and apparently Pete had been watching the same sky. Already dressed, eyes alert. "I see it," Pete said. "Get the paddock gate first," Rowan said. "Then start bringing the healthy ones in. I'll get Marshall." Marshall was the reason the latch on the south paddock gate mattered, because Marshall, at 16 years old, was Rowan's oldest horse and the foundation of everything. The horse his father had bred and Rowan had raised, and the animal whose bloodline ran through a quarter of the current herd. Marshall had been in the south paddock all day because he preferred it, and Rowan generally let him have his preferences because Marshall had earned them. But Marshall was also the horse that had been showing, for the past week, the first early signs of the same illness. Not severe, nothing like Scout or Pepper had been. But Rowan had watched him, and Evelyn had noticed, and they'd both been quietly concerned in the way you're concerned about something you're watching but not yet treating. A violent storm, a horse showing early symptoms, an open paddock. He ran. Evelyn ran beside him. He hadn't told her to come, hadn't even thought about it, and she hadn't asked. She'd simply come, the way she simply did things when they needed doing, without making a production of deciding to. The wind was building as they crossed the yard. Not the preliminary wind of a coming storm, but the real wind, the kind that carries things, that makes sound into a different register. The sky to the northwest was close enough now to see the lightning moving inside it. No thunder yet, which meant it was still distant enough for them to have some time, but not much. Pete was at the paddock gate. The latch was stuck. Of course it was, because the latch was always stuck when you needed it most, because that was the nature of bulky hardware in the middle of a crisis. Rowan got there and the two of them worked it together, Pete pulling and Rowan hitting the hinge side with the heel of his hand until something clicked and the gate came free. Marshall was at the far end of the paddock. He knew the storm was coming. Horses always knew, had some atmospheric sense about it that made them either calm or frantic, and Marshall was neither. He was simply alert, standing with his head up and his ears moving in quick, nervous increments. Rowan walked to him, slow, even pace, even though everything in him was running. "Easy," he said. "Come on, old man, come on." He got his hand on Marshall's halter, and the horse came willingly, which was Marshall's character. Whatever he felt, he trusted Rowan, and he'd trusted him for 16 years, and Rowan sometimes thought that trust was the most valuable thing on the property and never took it easily. They were halfway back across the paddock when the sky opened. Not rain first, lightning, a strike close enough that the sound and the flash arrived almost together, a crack boom that hit the air like a physical blow, and Marshall lurched sideways hard, pulling at the halter, and Rowan held on with both hands and talked him down without words. Just sound, steady sound, and the horse steadied under it but barely. Then the rain came, not gradually, all at once, the way Oklahoma rain sometimes came, like the sky had been holding it and simply let go. In 30 seconds, they were drenched. The rain was not warm summer rain. It was cold, cold in a way that said the storm had come down from somewhere north and brought the temperature with it, and Rowan felt it cut straight through his jacket like it wasn't there. He got Marshall to the stable and into his stall, and the horse was shaking. He could feel it through the halter, a fine, rapid trembling that was partly the cold and partly fear. And partly, Rowan thought with a dread that didn't have time to fully form, something else. Evelyn was there. She'd been ahead of him, had gotten there ahead of him somehow in the chaos, and she was moving through the stable checking the recovering horses, all 4 of them, running her hands along their necks and flanks with the quick efficiency of someone doing triage. "They're all right," she called over the sound of the rain on the roof. "The roof!" The roof answered for itself. A section near the east end, the section that hadn't been the one Rowan was repairing but the adjacent section, the one he'd told himself could wait another week, tore open with a sound like a gunshot, a crack, and then a sustained tearing, and cold rain poured through the gap directly onto the last stall. Scout's stall. Scout, who 4 days ago had been standing for the first time, who was still fragile in the way of something recently recovered, was standing in suddenly pouring rain with his newly recovering body going rigid with cold and shock. Rowan moved. Evelyn had already moved. They reached the stall at the same time, and Scout was wild-eyed, spinning in the small space, the rain pouring on him, and they got in there together without discussion and worked him out of the stall and into the center aisle, where Pete was already dragging one of the large horse blankets down from the rack. And between the three of them, they got the blanket over Scout and got him settled against the opposite wall away from the torn section, and Evelyn held his halter and put her face close to his neck and talked to him in that voice, that low, steady voice, while the storm tore at the roof above them and the rain moved sideways through the gap and soaked everything underneath it. Rowan looked at Marshall's stall, and his chest went tight. Marshall was down. Not the trembling and fighting down of an animal resisting. The collapse down of an animal that had gone past fighting. He was on his side, and his breathing was visible even from across the stable, fast and shallow, and his coat was soaked through from the rain he'd been in during the run to the stable, and Rowan crossed the distance between them in about 2 seconds and dropped to his knees in the straw. "Marshall," he said. He put his hand on the horse's neck. The heat was there. That radiating, wrong heat. "No," he said, very quietly, which wasn't to anyone in particular. It was just the word that came. Evelyn was behind him. She'd gotten Scout to Pete and come. She knelt beside Marshall and did what she always did. Eyes, gums, neck, flank, and her face in the dim, storm-battered light of the stable was doing something it hadn't done before, something more troubled than he'd seen from her. "He was showing signs before today," she said. "Yes. I should have started treatment this morning," she said, and the way she said it told him she'd been debating it and had decided to wait one more day for certainty, and that decision was sitting on her now. "You didn't know the storm. It doesn't matter," she said, cutting through the comfort cleanly. "It is what it is now." She put her hand on Marshall's neck. The horse's eye moved toward her, that same slow increment as Scout in the first days. "He's strong," she said, and she sounded like she was reminding herself as much as stating a fact. 16 years of strong is something. "What do we do?" Rowan asked. The question cost him something. He'd been solving problems on this ranch since he was 19 years old, and there was a particular quality to asking someone else what to do. Not weakness exactly, but the surrender of a reflex, the letting go of the idea that you should have the answer. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at him the way she'd looked at plants on the creek bank, assessing, steady, going through what she knew. "We start the strong preparation now," she said. "The creek valerian root. And we need heat in here. Marshall has to stay dry and warm, or the cold will do what the illness hasn't." "The roof," Rowan said, meaning it was torn, meaning the stable was no longer weatherproof, meaning the cold rain was still coming through the gap. "I know," she said. "Pete." Pete appeared instantly. "Can the roof be covered from outside in this?" she asked. Pete looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at the roof. He thought about what was up there and what tools he had and what could be done in a violent storm in the dark. "Tarpaulin," he said. "If Pete and I both get up there—" "I'll start the preparation," Evelyn said. "You fix the roof. I'll be here with him." The next 4 hours were the hardest of a summer that had already had a legitimate claim on that title. Rowan and Pete got on the stable roof in a storm that was actively trying to remove them from it. The tarpaulin, 2 of them lashed together, went up in a fight that involved Pete nearly coming off the edge twice, and Rowan straining every muscle in his back and arms, holding the canvas against wind that grabbed it like a sail. They got the first one down over the torn section. They got the second one overlapped and weighted with the roof stones that had been up there since his father put them. The rain did not stop coming through. It slowed. That was what they managed, slowing it, reducing it from a pour to a seep, and it was not perfect and it was not dry, but it was survivable. When Rowan came back down and walked into the stable, soaked and breathing hard, and with a deep new ache across his left shoulder where he'd wrenched it pulling the canvas, Evelyn was kneeling in the straw beside Marshall with the strong preparation, and the horse was still down and still had that fast, shallow breathing. But he'd taken some of the medicine. "How much?" Rowan asked, crouching. "Enough," she said. "He fought it at first. He took it." She had both hands on Marshall now, the way you hold something you are not prepared to let go of. "I need him to get through tonight." "He will," Rowan said, and he didn't know if he was saying it for her or for himself or for the horse or for all three. She looked at him. Her hair was completely loose. It had come entirely free at some point in the chaos, and she hadn't stopped to fix it. Her dress was wet from the rain she'd walked through, getting the preparation from the cookhouse fire, which she'd somehow kept burning through the storm, which Rowan still didn't fully understand how she'd managed. She looked exhausted in a way he'd never seen on her, not defeated, but stripped down, the way a person looks when all the practical energy has been spent and what's left is just the core of them. "Don't go inside," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said. She nodded. She turned back to Marshall. She put her hand on his neck and leaned close and started talking, and the storm continued to throw itself against the stable walls, and the lamp swung slowly in the drafts that came through every gap, and the other horses moved and settled and moved again, and Rowan Mercer sat on the floor of his stable in wet clothes with his bad shoulder complaining and watched the woman who had arrived 9 days ago on a train from Missouri refuse with everything she had to let his oldest horse die. And sometime in the third hour, when the storm was beginning to lose its worst energy, when the rain softened from violent to persistent, when the lamp had burned down a third of its oil and needed refilling, and Rowan got up to do it without being asked, sometime in that third hour, Marshall shifted his head, moved it deliberately, and put his nose against Evelyn's knee. She went very still. Then she put her hand on his jaw and held it there. "Okay," she said, very quietly, to the horse. "Okay. Stay with me." Rowan finished filling the lamp and set it back and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying, and because some moments belong to the people in them, and the only respectful thing for a witness to do is witness. The storm moved east. The rain became a drizzle and then stopped. Somewhere outside, water was running off the roof and dripping from the eaves in the ordinary way of aftermath, and the air coming through the stable door smelled of wet earth and lightning and the particular clean that comes after something violent has finished. Marshall was still breathing, still down, but his breathing had changed, slower, deeper, the breathing of an animal that had decided to stop fighting the crisis and start surviving it. Dawn was still 3 hours away. Evelyn sat back against the stall wall and closed her eyes for the first time all night, just for a moment, just long enough to take the weight off, and Rowan looked at her and looked at the horse and looked at the pale gray light beginning, faintly, impossibly early, at the eastern gap above the stable door. They were both still there. So was Marshall. And outside, beyond the battered stable with its patched roof and its soaked straw, and its 4 recovering horses, and its one old stallion who had decided somewhere in the dark hours to keep breathing, the prairie was washed clean and silent, and the sun was thinking about rising. Marshall opened his eyes at 6:15 in the morning. Rowan knew the exact time because he'd been watching the light change through the stable's east gap for the past hour, measuring the dawn in the way exhausted people measure things. Not with intention, but with the dull, persistent awareness of someone who has been awake too long and whose mind has run out of things to do except notice. The light had gone from black to gray to a thin, watery gold, and at 6:15, by the particular angle of it, Marshall's eyes opened. Not wide, not dramatic, just open. The slow, deliberate opening of an animal coming back into its own body from somewhere distant. Evelyn was asleep. She'd gone under sometime in the last hour, still sitting against the stall wall with her knees drawn up and her head tilted back. And Rowan had watched it happen. The gradual losing of the battle against her own exhaustion, the way her shoulders had dropped by degrees until finally everything in her simply gave out. He hadn't woken her. He'd sat across from her and kept watch and let her sleep, and now he looked at Marshall's open eyes and felt something move through his chest that he didn't have a clean word for. He leaned forward and put his hand on the horse's neck. Warm. Still too warm, the fever wasn't gone, but not the scorching heat of the night hours. Something had shifted. Something had stepped back from the edge. "Hey, old man," he said very quietly. Marshall's ear moved toward his voice. Evelyn woke up the way she seemed to do most things, quickly and without drama. One moment asleep, the next moment present, her eyes open and immediately finding the horse. She straightened away from the wall and moved to her knees in the straw, and put her hands on Marshall without hesitation, moving through the same assessment, always the same sequence, he'd noticed, always in the same order, like a song she'd memorized so long ago she didn't know she was singing it. Eyes, gums, neck, flank. She sat back on her heels. "The fever broke," she said. "I thought so," Rowan said. "His eyes." She nodded. She was looking at Marshall with an expression he recognized now, that private relief that she didn't perform for anyone, that she simply had, quietly, in whatever space she kept the things she actually felt. Her hair was still loose around her shoulders, her dress was still damp in places, and there was straw in her hair on the left side that she hadn't noticed yet. He didn't tell her about the straw. He wasn't sure why. It seemed like the wrong moment for it. "He's not through it," she said. "He needs the treatment for another week minimum, and he can't be stressed or cold." She looked at the patched roof. "The tarpaulin will hold for now. We need the actual section repaired before the next rain." "I know," he said. She looked at him, taking in the state of him the same way she took in everything, fully, practically, without sentimentality. He was wet and stiff, and his left shoulder was communicating its objections clearly, and he hadn't slept, and he probably looked like a man who had spent the night in a storm on a roof and then on a stable floor, because that was what he was. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you," he said. "I slept." For about 90 minutes against a wall? She almost smiled. "It counts." She stood, brushing straw from her skirt with the efficiency of someone who has done that particular motion many times. Her hand went to her hair and found the straw and removed it without comment. "Go sleep for 2 hours. I'll watch Marshall. Pete can do the morning feeding." "Evelyn?" 2 hours, Rowan." She said it the way she said things she wasn't going to argue about. He went. He lay down on his bed without removing his boots, which was something he hadn't done since he was 23 and working 2 ranches at once, and he was asleep before any thought could finish itself. He woke up at 9:30, and the house smelled like coffee and something baking, and outside the window the world looked washed and clean in the way of post-storm mornings, everything ordinary made slightly vivid, the fence lines and the paddock, and the distant line of the creek all sharp against a sky that had gone back to clear Oklahoma blue, as if the previous night had been a dream. He came downstairs and found Pete at the table eating cornbread with the focused appreciation of someone who has been up since before dawn and is genuinely grateful for food and a fresh pot of coffee on the stove and no Evelyn. "Stable," Pete said, without being asked. Rowan poured coffee and went to the stable and found Evelyn sitting on an overturned bucket outside Marshall's stall, reading from the leather-bound notebook. The notebook, one of the ones from the travel case, open across her knees. She closed it when he came in, not guiltily, just with the natural reflex of someone closing something private. She looked at Marshall, which is where his eyes went too. Marshall was standing. Unsteadily, with his weight slightly shifted and his head lower than usual, but standing on all 4 legs in his stall, and when he heard Rowan, he turned his head and looked at him with eyes that were dim but present, and something in Rowan's chest unclenched with a force that surprised him. He hadn't known how tightly he'd been holding it. He went to the stall, put his hand on Marshall's nose. The horse pushed against it lightly, barely, the minimum expression of his usual self. But it was there. "When?" he said. "About an hour ago," Evelyn said. "He got up on his own. I didn't help him." She said that specifically, and he understood why. Because a horse that gets up on its own is a different thing from a horse that's helped up. It means the animal has decided to be standing, which means the animal has decided something. "All right," Rowan said, and had to stop there because his throat had done something inconvenient. Evelyn let the moment be what it was. She had a gift for that, for not filling silences with words that would only dilute them. After a while, Rowan said, "I'll start on the roof repair this afternoon." "Jesse Tull sent word this morning," she said. "His boy came by while you were sleeping. He's coming this afternoon about the eastern quarter." Rowan turned from Marshall's stall. "You sent for him?" "I sent Pete with a note before the storm broke," she said. "Yesterday evening, before we knew about Marshall. I'd meant to tell you at supper, and then—" She gestured slightly, the economical gesture of someone indicating everything that had happened instead of enumerating it. The timing ended up being what it was. He looked at her. She was watching him with that level, patient attention, and he understood that she was giving him the chance to be bothered by this, to feel that she'd overstepped, moved a piece on his board without asking. He took a moment and examined whether he was bothered, honestly. He wasn't. "What did the note say?" he asked. "That you were interested in discussing the Eastern Quarter, and that if he was still looking to expand, today would be a good time to talk." She paused. "I didn't commit to anything. That's your conversation." "But you set it up." "Yes." He nodded slowly. 12 days, he said. She tilted her head slightly. "What?" "You've been here 12 days, he said. "In 12 days you've saved 5 horses, organized a land negotiation, treated half the sick animals in the Northern Territory, and made better cornbread than I've had in 3 years. "The cornbread isn't difficult," she said, and this time the almost smile became an actual one, brief and contained. "I'll accept the rest." Jesse Tull arrived at 2 in the afternoon, which was earlier than Rowan had expected, and suggested Tull had been interested before Evelyn's note arrived. He was a broad, deliberate man in his mid-40s who'd come to the territory 8 years ago from Tennessee and had built his ranch through the specific combination of patience, stubbornness, and an ability to read land value that people underestimated because he didn't talk much. He shook Rowan's hand, looked at the storm damage to the stable roof without commenting, and accepted a cup of coffee at the porch table. Evelyn brought the coffee and then went back to the stable, which was the right instinct. Tull was the kind of man who did business with men, not because he had anything against women, but because he'd been raised in a particular way, and his negotiations happened in a particular register that required 2 men and a handshake, and nothing that complicated the simplicity of it. Rowan understood this and didn't fight it. They talked for an hour, not just about the Eastern Quarter, about the season, about the horses, about the storm, about the territory generally. Tull knew how to get to the point by approaching it from every other direction first, which Rowan also knew how to do, so their conversation was a careful, unhurried circle that gradually drew inward. By the end of it, they had a price for the Eastern Quarter that was fair, not advantageous for Rowan, not a steal for Tull, and an agreement that Tull would come back in a week to finalize it, and they shook hands on that. When Tull's wagon had gone, Rowan sat on the porch steps for a while doing the arithmetic in his head. The Eastern Quarter plus 3 horses at fair market price. He'd spoken to Walt Deering that morning, briefly, and Walt had expressed interest in 2 of the recovered animals at a number that was more than reasonable. Put him clear of Carlton Hess with something left over. Not much, but something. He heard the stable door and Evelyn came out, reading the situation from his posture before she'd taken 3 steps toward him. She sat on the step beside him, not quite close enough to touch. "Well," she said. "We can do it," he said. She nodded, and the exhale she let out was small but real. "When?" "Tull comes back next week. Walt Deering's interested in copper and 3-spot. If I can close both before the end of the week, I can go to Hess with full payment before the deadline." "What does that feel like?" she asked. Not abstractly. She was asking him, specifically, what was happening inside him right now. He thought about it honestly. "Like putting down something I've been carrying so long, I forgot what my hands felt like empty," he said. She looked at the paddock. The recovering horses were in the south paddock today. All 4 of them, including Scout, who was moving well enough to be outside now. And Marshall, still in his stall for another week at least, but standing and eating this morning for the first time since the storm. She'd given Rowan the news about the eating when Tull arrived, and he'd had to work to keep it off his face in front of Tull because it was not the kind of thing you showed in a business negotiation. "The debt won't end the trouble with Hess," Evelyn said. "No," he said. "Men like Hess don't quit when you pay them. They just find a different angle." "What's his next angle?" she asked, and it wasn't theoretical. She was asking what he'd been thinking, what he knew about Hess that she didn't. "He wants the North Pasture," Rowan said. "Always has. It borders his mill land. If he can't get it through the loan arrangement, he'll try to get it some other way." He looked at the fence line. "He'll try through the water rights next, I think. There was some dispute about the creek 3 years ago that never got properly settled." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Is there a record of how the water rights were assigned?" "Should be in the county records. I have copies somewhere." "We should find them," she said. He looked at her. "Before we've even paid Hess off, you're already thinking about the next thing." "Yes," she said, "because the next thing will come, Rowan. That kind of man doesn't stop." She met his eyes. "You know that. You've known it since you signed that loan." He did know it. He'd known it when he signed it, and he'd done it anyway because he'd had no other choice, and he told himself he'd deal with the consequences when they arrived, which was a thing you tell yourself when you're out of options and need to move forward. "I know," he said. "Then let's deal with it before it surprises us," she said, simply, practically, as if this were entirely reasonable, this preparing for battles that hadn't started yet while still standing in the wreckage of the one that had, as if it were just the obvious next thing. He looked at her for a long moment and thought about the word Margaret had used for a certain kind of person. Margaret had said there were people in the world who organized their surroundings wherever they went. Not because they were controlling, but because disorder offended some deep part of them. And those people were exhausting to be around unless you were in crisis, and then they were the only ones you wanted. He'd laughed when she said it because she'd meant it about his aunt, who was a formidable woman universally regarded as difficult. He wasn't laughing now. He was just thinking about how right Margaret had been, and about how strange and specific the journey was that had brought this particular woman to this particular step at this particular moment. "All right," he said. "We'll find the water rights records tonight." The week that followed was a different kind of week from the ones before it. Less emergency, more reconstruction. The stable roof got properly repaired on Monday and Tuesday. Rowan and Pete with lumber from Hess's own mill, which Rowan paid for in cash and took a private satisfaction in, small and petty as that satisfaction was. Marshall progressed steadily, one day at a time, in the slow and stubborn way of old things recovering from serious illness. Not fast, not dramatic, but reliable. Every morning, a little more himself. Every evening, a little stronger. By Thursday, he was eating full rations and pushing at his stall door when Rowan came in, which was such a thoroughly normal Marshall thing to do that Pete had laughed when it happened. A real laugh. The first one Rowan had heard from him in weeks. Word about the horses had spread fully now. The territory talked, and what it was saying had changed completely. The name Mercer Ranch, which had been moving through conversations with the careful sympathy of an obituary, was now attached to something else. To the idea of the horses that had come back. To the woman who'd come from Missouri with a case of herbs and a dead woman's notebooks and had done what the veterinarian couldn't. People said it with something that started as curiosity and became, in the way these things become, the beginning of a story. The territory would tell about itself. 3 more people came that week with sick animals. Evelyn treated 2 of them and turned away the 3rd. A man with a horse that needed surgery, not herbs. And she said so plainly and told him he needed to get Doc Armand for this one. And the man had looked frustrated, but she hadn't apologized for the boundary because she'd meant it. Doc Armand himself came by on a Wednesday. Rowan hadn't expected that. He answered the door and there was Doc Armand on the porch, larger than usual somehow in the afternoon light, with his hat in his hands and an expression that was doing several things at once. "I heard about the horses," Doc said. "Come in," Rowan said. They sat at the kitchen table. Evelyn was in the back, working on a preparation, and Rowan called her name and she came in and stopped when she saw who was there. Something moved across her face. Rowan watched for it, but it settled quickly. "Miss Hartwell," Doc Armand said. He nodded, which with Doc Armand was the equivalent of a formal bow. "Doctor," she said. She sat down at the table with the directness of someone who has decided that the only way through an awkward thing is through it. There was a pause in which all three of them were aware of what was in the room with them, the fact that Doc Armand had failed with these horses and she had not, and the question of what that meant, and how they were all going to exist in the same small territory with that fact between them. Doc Armand said, "I'd like to know what you did." Evelyn looked at him. "Why?" Not hostile. Genuine question. "Because I've been a veterinarian for 18 years and I don't like not understanding something." He turned his hat brim in his hands, a gesture Rowan recognized from his own hands. "I'm not here to take credit for anything. I'm not here to challenge what you did. I'd just like to understand it." Evelyn was quiet for 3 seconds. Rowan recognized the quality of her silence. She was deciding, running through something internal, landing somewhere. "Do you have time?" she said. "I made time," he said. She went and got the notebooks. She didn't hand them to him. She opened them and explained them, page by page, for the better part of 2 hours, sitting at Rowan's kitchen table in the afternoon light. Rowan sat to the side and listened and watched Doc Armand's face move through skepticism and interest and something that looked by the end of it genuinely like respect. Not the polite, managed respect of a man being gracious, the real kind, which is harder to perform and therefore more recognizable. Doc Armand asked questions, real questions, the questions of a man actually trying to understand rather than trying to find the flaw. She answered them. Sometimes she said she didn't know, which he seemed to appreciate more than a confident wrong answer would have. When he left, he stopped at the door and said, "I'd like to send some cases your way, the ones I can't diagnose." Evelyn said, "I can't promise anything." "I know," Doc said. "I can't either. That makes 2 of us." He nodded again. "Good afternoon, Miss Hartwell." After he was gone, Rowan looked at Evelyn. She was standing at the door watching Doc Armand's buggy go up the road. "Well," he said. "That was unexpected," she said. "That's one word for it." She turned from the door. She looked, he thought, slightly shaken. Not in a bad way, but in the way of someone who has carried an expectation for a long time and had it replaced with something else and needs a moment to catch up. "He's a decent man," she said, sounding faintly surprised. "He is," Rowan said. "Better than most." She nodded slowly and went back to her preparation, and Rowan thought about all the times in Joplin that someone like Doc Armand had not been a decent man about it, and what that had done to her, and how much it mattered that this time the story had gone differently. He sold copper and 3-spot to Walt Deering on a Friday morning. Walt came out personally, looked the horses over. They were healthy, solid, better than they'd been before the illness, if Rowan was being honest, because Evelyn's maintenance treatments had left their coats in finer condition than he'd seen in years, and paid a fair price in cash, which Rowan counted and put in the strongbox under the kitchen floorboard without ceremony. The Toll land deal closed the following Wednesday. Rowan signed the papers at Frank Odell's place, which served as the territory's informal notary office, and Toll signed them, and they shook hands again with the same quality of handshake as the first time, and that was the Eastern Quarter gone. He had the money. All of it, with enough left that he could make the fence repairs and the roof repairs properly and have something toward next year's feed costs. Not enough to feel comfortable. He didn't think he was built for comfortable, and this land didn't encourage it anyway. But enough. He went to Carlton Hess on a Thursday. He'd thought about bringing someone with him, Pete, maybe, or Walt Deering, who'd offered when he'd heard what Rowan was doing. He decided against it. This was his conversation, and it needed to be his conversation. Just the 2 of them in Hess's office, and he needed to have it alone. He also thought about what to wear, which he normally never thought about, and he spent approximately 30 seconds looking at his better jacket before putting on the same jacket he always wore, because dressing up for Carlton Hess would be a form of deference, and he was done deferring. Hess was in his office when Rowan arrived. He was behind his desk with his clean hands folded and the same whiskey glass on the corner of the desk and the same comfortable expression. That expression that Rowan had seen in the general store, the one that assumed outcomes before they happened. Rowan put the money on the desk, all of it, in cash, in full, a week before the deadline. Hess looked at the money. He looked at it for long enough that Rowan understood something was happening behind his eyes. A recalculation, fast and uncomfortable. Then he looked up. "Your horses," he said. "People are saying the woman fixed them." "Well, people are right," Rowan said. Hess picked up the money and counted it. He was slow about it. Rowan stood and let him be slow about it because taking that from him would mean something, and Rowan was not going to give him the satisfaction of impatience. When Hess finished counting, he set the money down and looked at Rowan with an expression that had gone somewhere harder. The comfortable assumption was gone. What was under it was something more honest, which was not an improvement, but was at least the truth of the man. "This doesn't change what I said," Hess said, "about the North Pasture, about the water rights." "I know it doesn't," Rowan said. "The water rights were settled in 1886, and I have the county records." He paused. "I had my wife look them up." Hess's eyes moved slightly at the word wife. Calculating. "She's thorough," Rowan said. "You should know that. If you come at the water rights, she will have read every document that exists, and 3 she probably found that nobody else knew were there." He said this not as a threat. His voice stayed level, conversational, but as simple information, the way you tell someone about weather conditions before they plan an outdoor event. Hess looked at him. Something had shifted in the room, and both of them knew it, and neither of them named it. "You've changed, Mercer," Hess said, finally. "No," Rowan said. "I've just stopped being scared of you." He picked up the receipt that Hess had slid across the desk. Hess had signed it before Rowan arrived, which told him Hess had been expecting this, had been watching the situation develop and had prepared, and that was fine. Preparation was not the same as power. "Good day, Carlton." He walked out. He sat in his wagon outside Hess's building for about 2 minutes, and the 2 minutes were necessary because his hands were not entirely steady, and he needed them to be steady to drive. When they were, he picked up the reins and headed south, back toward the ranch, and the road that had felt different from every direction for the past 2 months felt, this afternoon, like it was going somewhere. What he found when he got home was not what he'd expected, which by now he should have learned to expect. That coming home to the Mercer Ranch in the year 1889 meant coming home to whatever was currently happening regardless of what he'd anticipated. What was happening was that there were 3 wagons outside his gate. 3 wagons he didn't recognize, which meant 3 sets of strangers, which meant Clara Finch's network had extended in directions he hadn't fully tracked. A woman he'd never seen was standing by the gate with a chicken under her arm. An obviously sick chicken, listing sideways in a way that even Rowan, who was not a chicken man, recognized as wrong. A family he vaguely recognized from the East Settlement, name beginning with M, stood near the second wagon with a child who kept looking toward the stable. The third wagon had a man in it who was still sitting on the bench with the posture of someone who has driven a long way and isn't sure they've arrived at the right place. Pete was managing them with the careful good manners of someone in over his head but trying. Rowan pulled in and Pete looked at him with an expression of profound relief. Evelyn was in the stable. He went to find her, and she was with the widow Callum again. The widow had come back, 3rd time now, with a different goat this time, and Evelyn was examining the animal with the same patient thoroughness she brought to everything, and the widow was talking without stopping, which was the widow's way, and Evelyn was listening in the part of her that didn't need to interrupt things to absorb them. "There are 3 wagons outside," Rowan said. Evelyn looked up. She registered this with the equanimity she brought to most things, but something crossed her face. Not alarm, more like the face of someone whose to-do list has just grown by an amount that requires acknowledgement. "The woman with the chicken came first," she said. "I was going to get to her after—" "I know," Rowan said. I'm not complaining." He stopped, started again. "I paid Hess." She looked at him fully, set the goat down. It landed and stood, which was a good sign for the goat. "All of it?" "All of it. Week early." He held out the receipt. She took it, read it. She read quickly and fully, always, and handed it back. And then she did something she hadn't done before, something small but significant. She put her hand briefly on his arm, just for a second, her fingers against his sleeve, and then took it back and turned toward the stable door. "Send the woman with the chicken in," she said, "and tell the family to wait." She glanced back. "Tell the man on the wagon there's coffee in the house. He's been there 40 minutes and he looks exhausted. Rowan stood there for a moment after she turned away, the hand on his arm. 1 second, gone. He went to manage the wagons. The days that followed accumulated with a different character than anything that had come before. The debt was gone. The immediate crisis was over. And what emerged in its absence was something neither of them had been paying much attention to while they were in the middle of surviving. The shape of the life they were making here. What it actually looked like when you stripped away the emergency and saw what was underneath. It looked like Evelyn at the outdoor grate every other morning. It looked like Pete gradually becoming her assistant without anyone assigning him that role. Just Pete materializing with the things she needed before she asked for them, learning her rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of someone you respect. It looked like Clara Finch coming on Tuesdays now instead of Thursdays, and staying longer, and the two women talking in a way that Rowan caught pieces of through the kitchen window. Not the careful assessing conversation of their first meeting, but the easier conversation of people who have found they understand each other. It looked like Rowan repairing things. Fence sections he'd been putting off for a year, the east barn door that had been wrong on its hinge since spring, the water trough that leaked at the joint. He worked through the list with a focus he hadn't had in months, because focus requires a foundation, and for the first time since June he had one under him. And it looked like evenings, supper and then the table, lamp burning, sometimes one of them reading, sometimes talking, sometimes neither, just the shared quiet of two people who had stopped needing to fill the air between them. On a Tuesday, about a week after he'd paid Hess, Rowan came in from the paddock at dusk and found Evelyn at the kitchen table with the notebooks open, both of them, which was unusual. She normally only worked with one at a time, and she was writing in the new one, the one she'd started since arriving, adding to it in that small, cramped hand. She looked up when he came in, and then looked at what she was writing with an expression he'd come to recognize as meaning she was in the middle of a thought. 2 minutes, she said. He washed at the pump and came back and started supper, and she finished whatever she was writing and closed the notebook and came to help without being asked, and they moved around the kitchen in the way they'd developed over 3 weeks. Nothing choreographed, just two people who'd learned where the other one stood. I'm writing down the Creek Valerian Protocol, she said while she sliced bread. What I did with Marshall specifically, the dosing, the timing, the combination, in case I need it again. She paused. In case someone else needs it. He looked at her sideways. Someone else. I'm not going to live forever, she said, with the matter-of-factness of someone stating a logistical reality. Neither is the knowledge. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. You're thinking about passing it on. I've been thinking about it since before I left Missouri, she said. It's why I kept adding to the notebooks, not just reading them. My grandmother passed the knowledge on by having me with her. I didn't have anyone with me in Joplin. She set down the bread knife. But here there might be. He waited. Clara's youngest girl, she said. Emmy. She's 12. She came by last week with Clara, and she spent the whole time watching what I was doing, and when I asked if she wanted to know what the plants were, she said yes before I'd finished the question. She picked up the bread knife again. That's what it looked like with me. That's the same look. Rowan thought about this, about a 12-year-old girl and a lineage of women who knew things that people needed, and what it meant that Evelyn was already thinking about where it went after her. Clara might have opinions about that, he said. Clara and I have already spoken about it, Evelyn said. He stopped. When? Last Tuesday. She carried the bread to the table. Clara is more open to it than you'd expect. Her own mother knew some plant remedies. She'd just never formalized it. She looked at him. She said Emmy can come on Saturdays if we agree. He put the pot on the table and looked at her across it. This woman. 12 days into a new territory, fighting a horse illness, organizing a land sale, managing the water rights paperwork, treating half the sick animals in 40 miles, and somewhere in there, quietly, beginning to plan the generation after her. You already agreed, he said. It wasn't a question. I said I'd talk to you first, she said. But you already decided, he said. She met his eyes and didn't deny it. I wanted to tell you, not ask you, she said carefully. I know the difference. I'm telling you. He sat down. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. Emmy can come on Saturdays, he said. She nodded once and sat down across from him, and they had supper in the good quiet. Marshall came out of his stall for the first time on a Friday morning, 2.5 weeks after the storm. Rowan was there for it. He'd been there every morning, checking on the horse's progress with the patient consistency of someone tending something that mattered. And he watched Marshall walk slowly out of the stable door and into the morning light of the paddock, and stop, and stand, and lift his head into the air the way he always had, the particular gesture of a horse identifying his own territory by its smell, its specific combination of grass and dust and water that meant home. Evelyn was standing beside Rowan. She'd come out when she heard the stable door, the way she always seemed to know when something significant was about to happen. They watched Marshall stand in the light. After a while, she said, "He's going to be all right?" "Yes," Rowan said. "Stronger than before, maybe. The ones who come back from something like that sometimes are." He looked at her. She was watching the horse with that expression, the private one, the one that wasn't for anyone else. He thought about all the things in the past 3 weeks that had not gone smoothly and had not been easy and had not looked the way good things were supposed to look when they were happening, and he thought about what it meant that they were standing here now. He said, "I want to say something." She turned, looked at him with her full attention, which was the only kind she had. "I know this started as an arrangement," he said, "a practical arrangement between two people who needed something. I know that's what we wrote to each other about and what we agreed to." He stopped, finding the right place to step. "But I want you to know that what I think of it now, what I think of you, has nothing to do with an arrangement." She was very still. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. This isn't a question. I'm just telling you." He looked back at Marshall. "You were right back at the beginning when you said you wanted honesty. So that's me being honest. That's all." The silence that followed was long enough that he began to wonder if he'd misjudged it entirely, if the directness that he'd meant as the simplest and most respectful thing had landed somewhere it shouldn't. He kept his eyes on Marshall. Then Evelyn said, "When I got on the train in Joplin, I was mostly scared." He looked at her. "Not of the territory or the work," she said. "I was scared that I'd get here and it would be," paused, choosing, "that it would be a transaction, a man who wanted a housekeeper and a body and would call it a wife." She looked at Marshall. "That's what I'd heard about these arrangements, mostly." "That's a fair thing to be scared of," he said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "It hasn't been that." "No," he said. She looked at him then directly, with those eyes that always seemed to be doing more work than most people's eyes. "It hasn't been easy," she said. "I want to be honest about that too." "It hasn't been easy," he agreed. "But," she paused again, longer this time. "When I was in the stable with Marshall during the storm, and you were on the roof in that weather," she pressed her lips together, "I thought if this were a transaction, that man would be in the house waiting to see what happened. He wouldn't be on the roof in a storm trying to save the thing I needed saved." She looked down at her hands. "That's not a small thing." "No," he said, "it's not." They stood there in the morning light, with Marshall moving slowly around the paddock in the tentative, careful way of something relearning its own strength, and the sky the clear, particular blue of Oklahoma in late August, and the creek audible from here, which Rowan had always liked, which he'd stopped noticing during the bad months, and was noticing again now. "I'd like to stay," Evelyn said. Not tentatively, not as a question. As the thing she had decided, stated in the way she stated decisions, plainly, without ornament. Not because of the arrangement, because of... He gestured slightly at the paddock, at the stable, at the house, and the land, and all of it. "This?" Rowan looked at the gesture and understood it to encompass considerably more than the property. "I'd like that," he said. And then, because honesty had worked for them this far, very much. Marshall reached the far end of the paddock and turned and came back toward them at the fence line. And when he got close, he stopped and put his nose over the top rail and looked at them both with the clear, dark eyes of a horse that has been sick and is not sick anymore. And Rowan put his hand up, and Marshall pushed into it, solid and warm and present, and the morning continued around them in all its ordinary, remarkable way. Emmy Finch arrived the first Saturday of September, carrying a basket her mother had packed with unnecessary food, the way mothers pack food when they're nervous about something and want to do something useful with their hands. She was 12 years old, Clara's youngest, with her mother's directness, and something else that was entirely her own, a quality of watchfulness that Evelyn had recognized immediately the week before, that particular stillness of a child who is absorbing everything around her and filing it somewhere precise. She stood at the gate and looked at the outdoor grate and the workbench and the organized rows of drying plants along the south wall of the cookhouse, and she didn't say anything for a full 10 seconds, which at 12 years old is a long time to not say anything. Then she said, "What's that one?" and pointed at a bundle of dried stalks hanging from the cookhouse eave. "Yarrow," Evelyn said. "Do you know it?" "My grandmother grew it in her garden," Emmy said. "She called it something different." "What did she call it?" Emmy thought. "Old woman's pepper," she said. Evelyn looked at her. "That's a better name," she said, and meant it, and Emmy's expression did something complicated and pleased, and she came through the gate. Rowan watched this from the porch for about 5 minutes before going back to his fence work, because he could see clearly that his presence was the least necessary thing at the south end of the property at this particular moment, and he'd learned by now when to be absent. The Saturday lessons, they didn't call them lessons, neither of them, but that's what they were, became the rhythm around which the rest of September organized itself. Emmy came at 8, stayed until early afternoon, and went home with a small notebook she'd started keeping, filling it with her own observations and her own names for things alongside the proper ones, the way Evelyn had told her to, both names, always, because the knowledge carried in the informal names was different from the knowledge carried in the formal ones, and both mattered. Clara came to collect her and stayed for coffee, and those Saturday afternoons on Rowan's porch with Clara's sharp conversation and Evelyn's quieter responses became a thing Rowan found himself not dreading, which was significant because he'd spent most of the past 3 years finding reasons to be somewhere else when company arrived. Something about the ranch had changed in its character, the way a room changes when furniture is moved. Same room, same walls, but the air sits differently. What also changed in September was Marshall. The old horse's recovery was not linear, which Evelyn had warned, and the warning had been right. There were days when he seemed fully himself, strong, alert, interested in his surroundings with the intelligent attention that had always been his. And there were days when he was tired in a deep way, the tiredness of an animal whose body had been through something serious and was still accounting for it. On the tired days, Rowan didn't push him. He went in and sat with him, sometimes, in the particular companionable silence you can only have with an animal you've known a long time. On one of those days, a Thursday, Evelyn came into the stable and found Rowan sitting on the upturned bucket outside Marshall's stall, not doing anything, just being there, and she came and stood beside him and looked at the horse. "He had a good morning," she said. "I know. He's just tired now." "That's different from sick," she said. "I know that too," he said. He looked up at her. "It's just hard to watch, after everything." She sat down on a hay bale across from him, which was not her usual posture. She was almost always in motion, almost always doing something with her hands. The sitting still was deliberate. "My grandmother had a horse," she said. "Old gray mare named Patience. She'd had her 20 years. When Patience started getting old, she used to say, she said, watching something you love get tired is different from watching it fail. Tired is just the cost of a long life. Failure is the cost of bad luck or bad timing." She paused. "Marshall didn't fail. He just got tired." Rowan looked at the horse. Marshall had his eyes half closed and his weight shifted onto his left hip, which was his resting posture, had always been since he was young. "He's going to be all right," Rowan said. "Yes," she said. "Different from before, maybe. Quieter. But all right." He nodded. And then, because he'd been carrying something for the better part of a week, and it was getting heavy. "Evelyn, I want to show you something." She waited. "Come with me," he said. He led her around the back of the stable, past the cookhouse, to the old storage cabin that sat at the eastern edge of the property, a building he'd been disappearing into for the past 2.5 weeks, always with some explanation about repair work, always in the hours when she was occupied with treatments or Emmy or the notebooks. The explanation hadn't been entirely untrue. There had been repair work, significant repair work. He opened the door. She stepped in. He watched her face. The cabin had been a storage space for 6 years, disorganized, dark, full of the accumulated miscellany of a working ranch. Now it had 2 workbenches along the south wall, a proper drying rack that Pete had helped him build along the north wall, with enough space for 3 times what the cookhouse eave could hold, a deep shelf system for the bottles and cloth packets and tools that currently lived in the travel case, a window he'd recut and enlarged to let in the south light, which was the right light for plant work, and in the corner, a small wood stove with its flue running clean and straight through the roof for the preparations that needed controlled heat. On one workbench, set carefully upright, the travel case, empty, its contents waiting to be given their permanent home. Above the door, hung on 2 nails, a line of wind chimes he'd made from the horseshoes pulled from Marshall's hooves after the storm when they'd been reset. They caught the light through the new window. They moved in the draft from the open door and made a sound that was light and irregular, the opposite of music but somehow better. Just sound, just the movement of metal in air, just the fact of something that had been through something hard and was still here making noise. Evelyn stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, taking it in. She looked at the workbenches, the drying rack, the shelves. She looked at the stove, and he could see her understanding the logic of it, the thought he'd put into placement, near the door for ventilation, away from the dry wood of the shelving. She looked at the window and the quality of light coming through it. Then she looked at the horseshoe chimes above the door for a long time. She didn't say anything for a while. He let her not say anything because he understood that this was one of those moments that words could damage if they arrived too soon. "The horseshoes," she said, finally. "Marshall's," he said. "The ones they pulled after the storm. The farrier reset them in April. I kept the old ones." He looked at them. Seemed like the right material. She reached up and touched one of them lightly, and they moved and sounded. She left her hand there, not holding them, just touching. "Rowan," she said. "You needed a proper place," he said. "The great works, but it's not. It's not yours. This is." He stopped. "Try it again. The knowledge your grandmother gave you, the work you do with it, what you're passing to Emmy, it deserves a permanent place, not the corner of someone else's cookhouse." She turned from the horseshoes and looked at him, and her expression was the one he'd seen only a few times, completely unguarded, without the practical layers she wore the way most people wore clothing. He'd seen it in the stable during the storm, and once when Marshall had stood up in the paddock, and once when Emmy had correctly identified Creek Valerian on her second Saturday. Each time it appeared and disappeared quickly, and each time it meant that something had gotten past whatever she used to manage what she felt. This time it stayed longer. "I don't know what to say," she said. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "It's just yours." She looked around the room one more time, slowly, and something settled in her face that he thought was probably the look of a person who has found, after a long time of not having one, a place that belongs to them. Not a resting place, a working place. Which for a woman like Evelyn was the same thing. She said, "I want to move the notebooks in today." "I figured," he said. She almost laughed. "You figured." "You've been moving since you arrived," he said. "I didn't think you'd stand still for long." This time she did laugh. A real one. Short and genuine and slightly surprised at itself, the way her laughs always were. As if she hadn't quite expected to be amused, but couldn't argue with the fact that she was. It was one of his favorite things about her, that laugh, and he hadn't told her so because telling her would make her self-conscious about it, and then it would happen less. They moved the notebooks in that afternoon, and the bottles, and the tools, and the cloth packets of dried material, all of it coming out of the travel case and finding its place on the shelves in an order that made sense to Evelyn, which he could see was a specific and considered order even if he didn't know the system yet. The travel case ended up empty on the bottom shelf, and she looked at it there for a moment. "That case came from Missouri with me," she said. "I know. My grandmother bought it at a dry goods store in St. Louis in 1851, she said. She told me that story 4 times, which meant it mattered. She touched the worn leather corner. She'd never been to St. Louis before that. She went specifically to buy a case big enough to carry everything she knew. Rowan looked at the case. A woman in 1851 traveling to St. Louis to buy a case for her knowledge. The particular kind of determination that took, in 1851, being who she was. She sounds like she was something, he said. She was everything, Evelyn said simply, without drama, the way you say a true thing you've had time to make peace with. The case stayed on the shelf, not put away, just resting, the way a thing rests when it's done its work and earned its place. Carlton Hess made his move in the second week of October. Rowan had been expecting it in the way you expect something you've been told is coming from a direction you can't fully see. Evelyn had found the water rights documents, all of them, including 2 that had been filed in a secondary county ledger that Frank Odell hadn't known about and that nobody had thought to look for, and which established with significant clarity that the creek and its 50-foot banks belonged to the Mercer Ranch, full stop, going back to the original land grant. Hess's challenge came through a lawyer from Guthrie, a man named Aldous, with expensive boots and the carefully cultivated vagueness of a man who made his living in the territory between what was legal and what was enforceable. He rode out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning and presented Rowan with a document claiming that the 1886 water rights settlement had contained an ambiguity that Hess now wished to formally contest. Rowan read the document on his porch with Aldous standing in the yard. Then he went inside and came back with the secondary county ledger filing, which Evelyn had copied in her precise handwriting onto fresh paper with every relevant section marked, and he handed it to Aldous without comment. Aldous read it. His face did not change in a way you could point to, but something behind it shifted. He read it twice. "Where did you find this?" he said. "County records," Rowan said. "This wasn't in the—" Aldous stopped. "No," Rowan said. "It wasn't in the obvious place. Someone had to look for it." He took the paper back. "Tell Carlton that the creek stays where it is, and that if he wants to spend money on lawyers arguing with the secondary county filing, that's his money to spend." Aldous left. He left the way men leave when they've arrived with something and are going back without it, which is a particular kind of leaving, all adjusted posture and too quick departure. Rowan watched him go from the porch and didn't feel triumphant about it. He felt tired in the way you feel tired when you realize that this particular battle was done, but the person behind it was still who they were, and that wasn't going to change. He went and found Evelyn. She was in the workshop. She called it the workshop now, which it was, with Emmy, who had started coming on Tuesday afternoons in addition to Saturdays, an arrangement Clara had permitted after Emmy had come home the previous week, and explained with 12-year-old intensity that she needed more time, that there was more to learn, that Saturday wasn't enough. Clara had looked at her youngest daughter making that argument and had apparently seen something in it that she recognized and couldn't argue with. Evelyn was showing Emmy how to dry the Creek Valerian root without losing its properties, which involved a specific timing and temperature that Emmy was writing down in her notebook with the focused seriousness of someone taking a deposition. Rowan stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment. The woman from Missouri and the girl from next door, bent over the workbench in the south light, the older one explaining with patience and the younger one absorbing with that quality of watchful stillness that had caught Evelyn's attention from the beginning. He thought about lineage, not blood lineage. The other kind, the kind that runs through knowledge and attention and the willingness to sit with someone and show them a thing they couldn't learn from a book. His father teaching him to read land. His father's father before that. The line of it. The fact that the line continued or it didn't, based entirely on whether someone made the effort. He thought about what the territory would look like in 10 years, 20. Emmy grown. Emmy showing someone else what Evelyn had shown her. The Creek Valerian root and the yarrow and the willow bark, and all of it, still alive in the hands of people who needed it, because a woman in Missouri had gotten on a train. He knocked on the doorframe and they both looked up. Hess's lawyer came, he said to Evelyn. "And?" she said. "He went," Rowan said. She held his eyes for a moment, reading the details behind the simple statement. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded when something was resolved that she'd been quietly holding. "Good," she said, and went back to the workbench. Emmy looked between them with the alert incomprehension of someone who knows a significant thing has just passed but doesn't know its full shape, and then went back to her notebook because she was 12 and she trusted that the adult conversation would be explained when it was relevant to her, and in the meantime there was Creek Valerian to understand. Rowan went back to the fence he'd been building on the west property line, The one that replaced the old rotted posts he'd been meaning to replace since before the summer. He worked through the afternoon with the physical satisfaction of straightforward work. Post, tamped earth, wire, post, tamped earth, wire. And thought about nothing complicated, which was its own kind of rest. At the end of October, something happened that Rowan hadn't anticipated, and that reframed, in a quiet way, his understanding of what Evelyn had built in her short months on the Mercer Ranch. A man came from 20 miles south. Not with a sick animal. He came on a Saturday morning, alone, in a wagon that had seen better years, and he asked at the gate for the woman who knew plants. Pete brought him to the workshop where Evelyn was with Emmy, and the man, he gave his name as Hargrove, said nothing further about himself beyond that, stood at the workshop door with his hat crushed in both hands, and said that his wife had been sick for 3 weeks with something that the doctor in his settlement couldn't identify, and that he'd heard about the woman at the Mercer Ranch. Evelyn looked at him. She said, "I'm not a doctor." "I know that," Hargrove said. "The doctor didn't help." She said, "Describe what she has." He described it. She listened with complete attention. She asked 4 questions, specific ones, and he answered them, and she was quiet for a moment. And then she said that she didn't know if she could help, but she'd like to try. And she went into the workshop and prepared something from the shelves. Rowan, watching from a respectful distance, couldn't see exactly what, and came back out with a cloth packet and a sheet of paper she'd written on. She handed them to Hargrove and explained what was in the packet and how to use it, and what signs to watch for that would mean it wasn't working, and in that case he should go back to the doctor and tell the doctor specifically what the doctor had missed. She said this last part plainly, without apology. Hargrove should know what to tell the doctor. She told him what to say. Hargrove looked at the packet. Then he looked at her. He was a large man, weathered in the way of men who work outside in all seasons, and he had the quality of someone who had been scared for weeks and was not all the way out of it yet. "What do I owe you?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Come back in 2 weeks and tell me how she is." He came back in 2 weeks. His wife had recovered. He came with a carved wooden box that he'd made himself, plainly, without ornamentation, and inside it was a note that said only, "Thank you, Hargrove." He left it at the gate with Pete and drove away before anyone could tell him it wasn't necessary. The box sat on the workshop shelf next to the travel case. Rowan saw it there one evening and didn't say anything about it, but he thought about what it meant. Not the gratitude, though that was real, but the specifics of it. A man who drove 40 miles round trip to bring a carved box. A man who came back. There was a quality of testimony in that. The testimony of someone whose life had been changed by a thing that hadn't asked for recognition and wasn't waiting for it. He thought about how many Hargroves there were and would be. How many people in a territory like this, wide and isolated and medically underserved and home to all the regular human catastrophes that didn't wait for convenient geography? Who needed what Evelyn knew? Who needed not a diploma or a claim of professional authority, but just someone with knowledge and patience who would listen to them and try? He was thinking about this on an evening in late November when he came in from the paddock and found Evelyn at the kitchen table with all 4 of the notebooks open, which was unusual enough that he stopped in the doorway. She was reading across them, cross-referencing something, moving her eyes from one to another with intense focus, and there was a piece of paper beside her that she'd been writing on. She looked up when she heard him. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "I want to talk about something," she said. "All right," he said. She looked at the notebooks. "Emmy is learning faster than I expected," she said. "She's going to need formal materials, not just what she can copy from watching me. Actual written materials she can study and reference and eventually use to teach someone else." She paused. "My grandmother's notebooks were written for my grandmother. My editions are written for me. Neither of them is written for a student." He looked at the paper she'd been writing on. It had the beginning of something on it, organized, structured, the beginning of a system. "You want to write a proper text," he said. "I want to write what I know," she said. "Clearly, completely. In a form that doesn't require me to be standing next to someone for it to make sense." She pressed her fingers against the notebook page. "My grandmother died, and almost everything died with her. Almost. I happened to be there, I happened to pay attention, I happened to get on the train. That's too many happenings. She looked at him. I don't want it to depend on happenings. He looked at her across the notebooks and the lamp and the October dark outside the window. That's a long project, he said. I know, she said. I'm not in a hurry. She looked at her own handwriting on the paper. I've been in a hurry my whole life. Here I don't feel like I have to be. He understood what she was saying and also what she wasn't saying, that this place had become a place where she could take the long view, where she didn't feel the pressure of impermanence, and that this was not something she'd expected and was not taking lightly. I can build you more shelving in the workshop, he said, for the drafts. Paper accumulates. She smiled, and it was the real one, not the almost smile. That's a very practical response to what I just said. You're a practical woman, he said. I was being practical back. She shook her head, but the smile stayed. Shelving would be useful, she admitted. He built the shelving the following weekend, with Pete's help and Emmy's unsolicited commentary on the optimal height of each shelf for her reach, which she delivered standing in the workshop doorway with the authority of someone who had been coming here long enough to feel she had a stake in it, which she did. December came, and with it the particular quality of winter in the Oklahoma Territory. Not harsh, not gentle, but real, the kind of cold that didn't pretend to be anything else and required preparation and respect. The ranch turned inward the way ranches do in winter, the rhythms slowing to maintenance and care and the steady work of keeping things alive through the cold. The horses grew their winter coats. Marshall's was thicker than usual, which Evelyn said was his body's response to what it had been through. Compensating, protecting, doing what bodies do when they've learned something about vulnerability. Rowan watched the horses in the paddock one December morning from the porch, his coffee hot in his hands, the air cold enough that his breath came out in small clouds, and he thought about the summer. He thought about it the way you think about something after enough distance has accumulated. Not in the emergency of it, not in the feeling of the worst nights, but in the shape of it, the arc, what it had been and what it had become. He thought about Cherokee dying in the dark in June and the slow, catastrophic accumulation of loss that had followed. He thought about standing on the train platform with his hat in his hands and not knowing who he was waiting for. He thought about Carlton Hess's boot on his paperwork and the particular grinding humiliation of that. He thought about Scout drinking apple pieces from Evelyn's hand, Marshall pushing his nose against the water bucket at 2 a.m, Pepper eating grain for the first time, Pete's long exhale when the first horse stood. He thought about a storm tearing through a stable and 2 people who had just met refusing together to let something die. The thing he kept coming back to, the thing that he hadn't expected and still couldn't fully account for, but was how the worst summer of his life had produced the conditions for the best thing in it. Not despite the difficulty, but because of it. The crisis had demanded everything, and in demanding everything had stripped away all the usual obstacles to knowing another person. The careful presentation, the managed distance, the slow accumulation of trust that usually takes years. He and Evelyn had skipped all of that. They'd gone straight to the floor of a stable at 3 a.m. and they'd found out what they were made of, both of them together. He didn't think that was luck. He thought it was the territory's version of mercy, brutal, unscheduled, not what you'd choose, but real. Evelyn came out and stood beside him. She'd brought the coffee pot and refilled his cup without asking, which was one of the small accumulated things she did without making a gesture of them. The same way she'd made coffee that first morning before he was awake. The same quality of simply seeing what was needed and doing it without announcement. She looked out at the horses. Marshall's moving well this morning, she said. I noticed, he said. His winter coat is coming in thicker than last year's. You checked? Pete told me. He's been watching Marshall the way you watch something you almost lost. She glanced at him sideways, like someone else I know. He looked at her. Is that a criticism? It's an observation, she said. Watching isn't bad. It means you know what you have. She looked back at the horses. A lot of people don't. He thought about that, about the specific blindness of having something so long you stop seeing it, the land, the horses, the life he'd built here that he'd almost let dissolve into Carlton Hess's ledger books without fighting for it properly. What it had taken to make him fight. Who had stood beside him when he did. Evelyn, he said. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know it's not because of the arrangement or the debt or anything practical. She turned and looked at him fully, which was how she always listened to things that mattered, completely, without the part of her attention already moving to the next thing. "I want to know if you'd be willing to make this permanent," he said. "Not as a practical arrangement, as what it actually is." He stopped, found the right words and used them. "As a marriage." She was quiet for a moment. The horses moved in the paddock. The cold air sat between them, carrying their breath in small matching clouds. "It already is what it actually is," she said. He looked at her. "I mean, the question is reasonable," she said, "but I'm not sure what you think would change." "I want you to know it's what I mean," he said, "that it's not, that I'm not going to one day decide the arrangement is done. I want you to know that I mean—" He stopped again. He was not good at this, and they both knew it, and he was doing it anyway, because that was, it turned out, what you did. "Permanently," he said. "I mean, permanently." She looked at him with those clear, assessing eyes, and he could see her taking it in the way she took in everything, fully, not rushing to respond, giving the thing its proper weight. "So do I," she said, simply, without ornament. He nodded. She nodded. The horses moved in the cold morning air, and Marshall came to the fence and looked at them both with his dark, intelligent eyes, and Rowan put his hand up, and the old horse put his nose against it, and they stood there in the December light, impermanent, imperfect, none of it clean or easy or the way things look in stories told after the fact when all the rough edges have been smoothed by time. It was better than that. It was the actual thing, which is always more complicated and more sturdy than the story told about it. Rowan Mercer had spent the worst summer of his life watching everything he'd built die by degrees, and he'd learned something from it that he couldn't have learned any other way, not from good seasons or prosperous years or the comfortable accumulation of things going right. You don't learn what you're made of from good years. You learn it from the ground up, on stable floors in storms, on rooftops in rain, in the 3 a.m. dark, when the thing you love is barely breathing and you decide to stay. He'd learned that survival isn't a solitary act. He'd believed it was, for 3 years after Margaret, had lived inside that belief the way you live inside a habit you've stopped examining. He'd been wrong. What had saved this ranch wasn't his stubbornness or his labor or even his love for the land his father had broken himself building. It was the willingness, small, terrifying, necessary, to let someone in, to say, "I don't know," to say, "Help me," to look at a woman stepping off a train carrying a battered case and think, "Maybe." And Evelyn had learned something too, though she expressed it differently, in the careful documentation of the notebooks, in the way she taught Emmy, in the deliberate act of writing down what she knew so that it couldn't die with her. She had spent years carrying knowledge that the world told her was worthless, performing it in secret or watching it wither from disuse. What she learned here was that the knowledge's value had never been in question. The people who dismissed it had simply been wrong. And the only honest response to being told for years that what you know doesn't matter is to go somewhere that proves otherwise and keep working. The workshop light burned on Tuesday and Saturday afternoons, and sometimes in the evenings when Evelyn was writing. Emmy Finch grew. Her notebook filled, and a second one started. Doc Armand sent 3 cases that winter, all of them the kind he couldn't diagnose, and Evelyn resolved 2 of them and referred the third back with specific instructions about what to look for. She was building something, not a practice, not a business, but a body of work, the slow and unspectacular accumulation of careful knowledge applied to real problems, the thing her grandmother had given her replicating outward into the territory in the same way a creek valerian root spreads from a single plant along damp soil, patient, persistent, alive. The Mercer Ranch did not become a legend. It didn't become a landmark or a destination or anything that required a story larger than what it was. What it became was known, the kind of known that belongs to things that prove reliable over time. People who needed help came, and sometimes the help was there and sometimes it wasn't, and Evelyn was honest about both, which was the only kind of reliability that actually lasts. Marshall lived 2 more years after the summer of 1889, which was longer than the illness had given them reason to expect, and shorter than Rowan would have chosen. He died on a spring morning in 1892. on his own feet in the south paddock, which was what Evelyn had said was the best outcome. Not fighting it, not down in a stall, but simply finishing. The way a life finishes when it's done what it came to do. Rowan buried him in the south field under the big cottonwood and marked the place with a stone he'd pulled from the creek bed, which he thought was right because that was where everything had started turning around. He went to that stone sometimes. Not often, just to remember what it cost and what it gave back. The horseshoe wind chimes above the workshop door were still there. They moved in the spring wind and made their light, irregular sound, and Emmy had long since stopped noticing them consciously, the way you stop noticing something that has always been there, which was itself a kind of permanence. The thing so woven into the ordinary that it becomes part of what ordinary means. That was the legacy. Not grand, not the kind of thing anyone would carve into a monument, just the knowledge, still moving, still alive, still needed, which is the only kind that lasts.